Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the glittering, tragic world of the Romanov dynasty's diamond stones, so magnificent they could ransom kingdoms, yet so cursed they seem to carry the weight of revolution in every facet. You're standing in a candlelit palace corridor, and through half-open doors you glimpse tiara after tiara, each one crowned with diamonds that catch the light like frozen stars. The air smells of beeswax and old velvet, and somewhere in the distance, a clock chimes midnight. These weren't just jewels. They were symbols of absolute power, tokens of diplomatic marriages, and ultimately, treasures that vanished into the chaos of 1917, scattering across continents like shrapnel from an exploding empire. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for. How did a Russian empress's diamond necklace end up around a Broadway actress's throat? And why do some of the world's most famous gems carry whispers of blood and betrayal? So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or maybe share which historical mystery keeps you awake. Your support means everything, and it helps me bring you more of these deep dives into forgotten history. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're in St. Petersburg, 1762, and a German princess named Sophie has just seized the Russian throne through a coup that would make any political thriller jealous. She's renamed herself Catherine, and she's about to become the Great for reasons that go far beyond military conquest. Catherine understands something profound about power it must be seen to be believed, and nothing makes power visible quite like diamonds. You watch as she commissions craftsmen from across Europe, summoning them to her court with promises of gold and prestige. She's not just collecting pretty stones, she's building a visual language of imperial legitimacy, one sparkling piece at a time. Her agents scour the world. They travel to India, where the legendary Golconda mines produce diamonds of such clarity they seem to hold light itself captive. They negotiate in Amsterdam's cutting houses, where Jewish artisans transform rough stones into geometric miracles. They bid at auctions in Paris, outbidding French nobles who suddenly find themselves outgunned by Russian wealth. Catherine doesn't just want diamonds, she wants the world's best diamonds, and she has the treasury of the largest country on earth to make it happen. Historians still argue whether her obsession stemmed from genuine aesthetic appreciation or calculated political theatre. But honestly, why not both? You're present when Catherine receives her first major acquisition, a necklace containing 475 diamonds arranged in cascading loops that shimmer like a frozen waterfall. The piece weighs heavy in your hands, not just physically, but with the weight of ambition. She wears it to her first major state reception, and you can see the effect ripple through the crowd. Foreign ambassadors literally gasp. Rival nobles pale with envy. The message is clear: Russia isn't some frozen backwater anymore. Russia's arrived, and it's dripping in brilliance. But Catherine's diamond hunger goes beyond personal adornment. She establishes what will become the imperial crown jewels as a permanent state collection, separate from her personal belongings. This is revolutionary thinking. These diamonds don't belong to Catherine the woman. They belong to the Russian crown itself. To be passed down through generations, she's creating a treasure that will outlast her. A collection that future empresses will add to, each one trying to outshine the last. It's like a competitive sport played with stones worth more than entire provinces. You follow Catherine into her private chambers one evening, where she's examining a recent purchase, a single diamond the size of a quail's egg, so perfectly cut it seems to glow from within. Her jeweller explains the stone's journey from an Indian mine to a Persian Shah's turban, to a Turkish sultan's treasury, to, finally, her hands. The diamond has witnessed empires rise and fall. It survived wars, assassinations, and regime changes. And now it belongs to Russia. Catherine holds it up to candlelight, and for a moment you see her smile, not the public smile of an empress, but the private grin of a woman who's pulled off something remarkable. She commissions tiaras that take 2 years to complete, each one a masterwork of design. She orders diamond-encrusted frames for miniature portraits of her lovers awkward, but very on-brand for Catherine. She even has diamonds sewn onto a coronation gown in patterns that spell out her monogram in light. The woman doesn't do subtle. By the time Catherine dies in 1796, she's transformed the Russian imperial collection into something unprecedented in European history, a hoard that makes the French crown jewels look like costume jewellery. But here's the quirky detail that gets lost in most histories. Catherine kept a diamond diary, a private ledger where she recorded not just what she bought, but why. Next to a spectacular brooch, she might write, "Purchased to remind Ambassador Schmidt that Russia is wealthier than Prussia." Beside a pair of earrings, commissioned to outshine that insufferable Swedish queen at the next ball. The diamonds weren't just beautiful objects to Catherine. They were weapons in diplomatic warfare, and she wielded them with strategic precision. You watch as her successors, Paul, Alexander, Nicholas, they each add their contributions to the collection. The pile grows, diamond mountains accumulate in the palace vaults. Each emperor tries to prove his legitimacy through ever more spectacular acquisitions. It becomes almost comical, this arms race of sparkle, except that it's deadly serious. These stones represent the concentrated wealth of millions of peasants, the surplus extracted from a nation where most people live in wooden huts and survive on black bread. The contrast is obscene, but nobody in the Winter Palace seems to notice or care. By the time you reach the reign of Alexander III in the 1880s, the collection has grown beyond even Catherine's wildest dreams. There are diamonds that have their own names, their own legends, their own rooms, and the Romanovs just keep buying more, as if accumulating enough brilliance might somehow protect them from the darkness gathering on the horizon. You stand in the imperial treasury on a winter morning in 1890, your breath fogging in the cold air despite the room's supposed heating. Before you stretch rows of glass cases, each one containing enough wealth to feed a province for a year. Alexander III walks through with his wife, Maria Fyodorovna, and you notice how casually they gesture at pieces that would make a modern billionaire weep with envy. "That one's nice," Maria says, pointing at a tiara containing 200 carats of diamonds. "Nice," as if she's discussing wallpaper. The couple is planning their daughter's coming-out ball, and Maria wants something special. The imperial jewelers are summoned, and over the next 6 months, they create a diamond kokoshnik, a traditional Russian headdress that contains over 1,000 individual stones arranged in a rising sun pattern. When completed, it's so heavy it gives the Grand Duchess headaches, but it photographs magnificently, which is apparently all that matters. The piece will survive the revolution and eventually end up in Queen Elizabeth II's collection. But that's a story for later sections. You're beginning to understand the scale of what's been accumulated here. This isn't just a collection, it's an obsession that's consumed over a century of imperial attention and unfathomable wealth. Catherine the Great started something that became unstoppable, a dynasty defined by its diamonds, a royal house that measured its success in carats and clarity. And as you leave the treasury that evening, walking past guards who will themselves be swept away in revolution, you wonder, can beauty this extreme survive the ugliness that's coming? You descend a stone staircase in the Moscow Kremlin, your footsteps echoing against walls that have witnessed 5 centuries of Russian history. The air grows cooler with each step, and you catch the metallic scent of old iron and older secrets. You're heading toward the Diamond Fund vault, though in the 1900s it's simply called the Imperial Treasury, a fortress within a fortress where the Romanov diamond collection lives under guard so heavy it borders on paranoia. 3 separate locks seal the main door, and 3 different officials each hold one key. Nobody enters alone. Nobody enters without witnesses. The diamonds are that valuable, and human nature is apparently that predictable. The vault itself is surprisingly modest in appearance, just stone walls, reinforced doors, and rows upon rows of wooden cabinets with brass fittings. But when the custodian opens the first cabinet, you understand why paranoia is justified. Inside, nestled on velvet cushions, sit diamonds that catch the lamplight and multiply it into rainbow fragments that dance across the ceiling. There's the Shah diamond, a yellow stone weighing 88.7 carats, with Persian inscriptions etched into its surface by some long-dead court artisan. Next to it rests the Orloff diamond, nearly 190 carats of Indian brilliance that Catherine the Great received from her lover, Count Grigory Orloff, who allegedly bought it from an Armenian merchant who'd stolen it from a Hindu temple statue. The provenance is definitely questionable, but the diamond is undeniably spectacular. You move to the next cabinet, and the custodian, a nervous man named Dmitri, who's worked here for 20 years, explains the organisation system. Crowns occupy the top shelf, arranged by reign. Below them, tiaras and kokoshniks, sorted by weight and historical importance. Then necklaces, bracelets, brooches, earrings, rings, and finally, loose stones awaiting setting. It's like a library, except instead of books, you're cataloguing concentrated starlight. Dmitri handles each piece with white cotton gloves and the reverence you'd normally reserve for religious relics. These aren't just jewels, he whispers, because everyone whispers in the vault. These are Russia herself, compressed into crystal. Historians still argue whether the Romanovs truly understood the symbolic weight they'd placed on these stones, or whether they simply enjoyed pretty things and the rest was justification after the fact. You're leaning toward a bit of both as you examine Alexander II's crown, created for his coronation in 1855. The piece contains nearly 5,000 diamonds, including a massive red spinel on top that everyone mistakenly calls a ruby because it's easier than explaining mineralogy. The crown weighs almost 4 pounds, and you can't imagine wearing it for a 5-hour ceremony without developing serious neck problems. But that's autocracy for you suffering for sparkle. The vault contains peculiar treasures beyond the famous pieces. There's a diamond-encrusted icon of St. Nicholas that's equal parts religious devotion and conspicuous consumption. There's a mechanical peacock with diamond feathers that actually spreads its tail when wound a gift from some foreign dignitary with more money than sense. There's even a diamond-handled letter opener, because apparently regular letter openers were too pedestrian for people who ruled 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. You're starting to notice a pattern if it existed. The Romanovs tried to cover it in diamonds, but security, despite all the locks and guards, has its absurd moments. Dmitri reluctantly tells you about the incident in 1896, when a Grand Duchess wanted to borrow a particular necklace for a ball, but couldn't find the key-holding officials. So she simply ordered a guard to break the lock, took what she wanted, and left a note saying she'd return it tomorrow. And she did. The system ran on a bizarre combination of Fort Knox-level security and aristocratic entitlement that completely undermined said security. It's like installing a state-of-the-art alarm system and then leaving the front door open because you trust your neighbours. You're present during the monthly inventory, a process so tedious it takes 3 full days to complete. Each piece must be removed, examined, documented, and returned. 2 witnesses verify every step. The paperwork alone could probably fill a small library. During the 1913 inventory, celebrating the dynasty's 300th anniversary, the officials discover they've somehow acquired 200 more diamond pieces than they have documentation for. Nobody knows where they came from. Nobody knows who bought them. They just appeared, like mushrooms after rain, because that's apparently how imperial treasuries work when you have more money than organizational skills. The vault's most impressive section, and Dmitri saves this for last, contains the Great Parures, complete matching sets that took years to assemble. You're looking at Empress Maria Alexandrovna's sapphire and diamond parure necklace, earrings, brooch, bracelet, and tiara, all featuring matched Ceylon sapphires surrounded by rising diamond flames. The craftsmanship is so precise that the pieces seem to flow like liquid jewellery, each element perfectly balanced with the others. When worn together, the effect was apparently so stunning that other women at court reportedly refused to attend events where Maria planned to wear the complete set. Knowing they'd be completely eclipsed, talk about a power move. There's a practical side to all this hoarding, though it's rarely discussed. These diamonds serve as a kind of state emergency fund, a reserve of portable, universally valuable assets that could theoretically be liquidated in crisis. Several times during wars or economic downturns, finance ministers quietly suggested selling some pieces to raise funds. Each time the reigning Tsar refused, as if selling the diamonds would somehow mean admitting defeat or weakness. The stones become more than wealth, they're symbols of continuity, proof that the dynasty endures regardless of temporary setbacks. You notice something odd as you examine the vault's guest ledger, which records every official visit since 1850, foreign dignitaries, potential brides for grand dukes, military heroes receiving decorations. They all get vault tours as part of their Kremlin visit. It's psychological warfare disguised as hospitality. The message is clear. Look what we have. Imagine what we could do with resources like these. Think twice before challenging Russian interests. The diamonds are diplomatic tools, silent ambassadors that speak volumes without saying a word. As you prepare to leave the vault, Dmitri carefully closes each cabinet, checks each lock, and signs the exit log with a flourish. "These will be here forever," he says with absolute confidence. "Long after we're dust, these stones will still catch light in this room." You don't have the heart to tell him that in less than a decade, revolution will shatter his certainty along with everything else, and these carefully guarded treasures will scatter to the four winds like dandelion seeds in a hurricane. But for now, in this moment, surrounded by the accumulated brilliance of imperial ambition, forever feels almost believable. You ask Dmitri about security procedures, and he brightens. This is clearly his favourite topic. He explains the guard rotation schedule, which ensures that no single guard works the vault entrance for more than 4 hours at a stretch, presumably to prevent boredom-induced negligence or theft-enabling corruption. He describes the alarm system, which is cutting edge for 1905 bells connected by wires that ring in the guardhouse if any cabinet is opened without proper authorization. He's particularly proud of the floor tiles, which are apparently weighted, remove anything heavier than 5 pounds, and pressure plates trigger alerts. Though, he admits sheepishly, we had to disable that feature because officials kept triggering it by leaning against cabinets. So much for cutting-edge security. The vault employs a staff of 8-3 custodians, 2 guards, 2 clerks who maintain the endless documentation, and 1 master jeweller who performs annual condition assessments. These men know more about the imperial diamonds than the Romanovs themselves. Having spent careers studying every facet and flaw, they can identify pieces by touch in complete darkness. They've memorized the weight and cut of thousands of individual stones, and they're paid reasonably well to ensure their loyalty. though reasonably well is relative when you're surrounded by wealth that could purchase small nations, the temptation must be extraordinary, yet recorded thefts are remarkably rare. Either the security works, or the thieves are just very, very good at not getting caught. You're in the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, watching Empress Alexandra Feodorovna prepare for the 1903 Winter Palace Costume Ball, the last great celebration before everything falls apart. She sits at her vanity while her lady's maid carefully positions a diamond tiara on her elaborately styled hair. This isn't just any tiara. This is the piece that will haunt historians and jewellery obsessives for the next century, the diamond-fringed tiara, sometimes called Alexandra's kokoshnik, a towering confection of graduated diamond spikes that makes her look like she's wearing a frozen sunrise. The piece contains 488 individual diamonds arranged in delicate platinum settings that seem to defy gravity, rising nearly 5 inches above her forehead. When she moves, the diamonds catch candlelight and send sparkles dancing across the walls like trapped fireflies. Alexandra loves this tiara with an intensity that borders on obsession, which is saying something given that she has literal rooms full of jewellery to choose from. She wears it to every important state function, every diplomatic reception, every occasion where she needs to project imperial authority. In photographs from the period, you can identify Alexandra instantly by that distinctive diamond fringe, even when her face is turned away. The tiara becomes as much a part of her identity as her lilac perfume or her unfortunate habit of trusting Rasputin's medical advice. But there's something else about this piece. Something that makes servants whisper when they think nobody's listening. They say it's cursed. The superstition starts innocuously enough. Alexandra first wears the tiara at the 1896 coronation festivities for her husband, Nicholas II. During the celebration, a catastrophic crowd crush at Kudinka Field kills over 300 people when peasants stampede for free beer and commemorative cups. Alexandra wants to cancel the remaining celebrations and enter official mourning, but court officials convince Nicholas to proceed as planned. Cancelling would suggest weakness, so Alexandra attends a ball that very evening, wearing the diamond tiara while the bodies are still being collected from the field. The optics are absolutely terrible, and whispers begin immediately the tiara is unlucky, perhaps even cursed by the innocent blood spilled on what should have been a joyful day. You follow Alexandra through the years, watching the supposed curse accumulate evidence. She wears the tiara at the 1904 ball, celebrating the birth of her son, Alexei, and within months, the family discovers the boy has haemophilia, a diagnosis that will dominate and ultimately help doom the dynasty. She wears it to the 1913 Romanov tercentenary celebrations, and the massive festivities drain the treasury while highlighting how disconnected the imperial family has become from ordinary Russians who are starving in the countryside. She wears it in 1914 photographs taken just before World War I erupts, plunging Russia into a conflict that will kill millions and destabilize the regime beyond recovery. Historians still argue whether the tiara curse is genuine supernatural phenomenon or simply confirmation bias, people remembering the bad events and forgetting the uneventful times when Alexandra wore it without incident. You're betting on confirmation bias, but you have to admit the pattern is eerie. The tiara itself has a fascinating technical story that gets overshadowed by curse mythology. It was created by the court jeweller Berlin in 1890, originally commissioned by Alexander III as a birthday gift for his wife, Maria Feodorovna. The design draws inspiration from traditional Russian kokoshnik headdresses worn by peasant women, which is deeply ironic an empress wearing a multi-million-dollar interpretation of what poor women wear to church. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, Each diamond is individually calibrated so the whole piece maintains perfect visual balance, despite using stones of varying sizes. The platinum framework is so delicate it looks like lace, yet it's strong enough to hold nearly 500 diamonds without bending or breaking. Modern jewellers who've examined photographs estimate it would take a master craftsman 18 months to replicate. Assuming you could even find diamonds of comparable quality. But here's the quirky detail that rarely makes it into history books. Alexandra hated wearing the tiara because it gave her splitting headaches. The piece weighs just over a pound, and that weight sits entirely on the crown of the head, creating pressure that builds over hours. Contemporary accounts mention Alexandra frequently massaging her temples after state functions, and her personal physician prescribed her increasingly strong headache powders throughout the 1900s. One lady-in-waiting, Catulle, wrote in her diary that Her Majesty suffers more from her vanity than from her tiara, as she refuses to wear anything less impressive despite the pain. So Alexandra is essentially enduring migraine-level discomfort to project imperial authority, which is either admirably dedicated or slightly unhinged depending on your perspective. You're in Alexandra's private sitting room in 1916 and she's examining the tiara with uncharacteristic melancholy. The war is going badly. Nicholas is at the front making disastrous military decisions. Rasputin has just been murdered by nobles trying to save the dynasty from what they see as his malevolent influence. And Alexandra, holding her beloved tiara, tells her maid something chilling. This piece has seen everything, our highest moments and our approaching end. Perhaps after I'm gone, someone will wear it and remember that we tried to be good. It's heartbreaking and oblivious in equal measure. Yes, Alexandra tried to be good by her understanding, but her understanding was so disconnected from reality that trying wasn't nearly enough. The tiara makes its last public appearance in a photograph taken in early 1917, just weeks before the February Revolution. Alexandra poses with her daughters, and while the girls wear simpler jewellery, their mother crowns herself with the diamond fringe one final time. She looks exhausted in the image, dark circles under her eyes, a tight smile that doesn't reach her expression, her hand gripping the chair arm with white-knuckled intensity. The tiara still sparkles brilliantly, because diamonds don't care about political instability or family tragedy. They just reflect light with the same impartial beauty regardless of context. After the revolution, when the Bolsheviks arrest the imperial family and eventually move them to Ekaterinburg, Alexandra is allowed to bring a small trunk of personal items. She includes the diamond tiara, carefully wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath clothing. It's an odd choice when you think about it. They're being held prisoner, facing possible execution, and she's worried about saving a tiara. But maybe it represents something beyond monetary value to her memory, identity, continuity with a life that's being systematically destroyed. Or maybe she thought she could use it to bribe guards or buy safe passage. Though that plan, if it existed, clearly didn't work. The last confirmed sighting of Alexandra's tiara comes from Yakov Yurovsky, the Bolshevik commander who will later oversee the family's execution. In his memoirs, written years later, he describes searching the imperial family's belongings and finding jewels sewn into clothing and hidden in unexpected places. He specifically mentions a diamond kokoshnik of exceptional size that made even hardened revolutionaries pause in appreciation before confiscating it. After that, the trail goes cold. The tiara enters the vast fog of post-revolutionary chaos, where tens of thousands of imperial treasures were seized, catalogued sometimes, and redistributed often, or simply vanished into private collections frequently. Modern researchers have proposed various theories about what happened to Alexandra's cursed tiara. Some believe it was broken apart and the diamonds sold individually, more profitable that way. and it eliminates the recognizable design that might attract unwanted attention. Others think it survived intact and sits in a private collection somewhere, owned by someone who has no idea of its history or significance. A few optimistic historians hold out hope that it's in a state museum storage, misidentified or simply overlooked in inventory records that span millions of items. And then there are the romantic conspiracy theorists who insist the tiara was smuggled out of Russia entirely, carried by a loyal servant who escaped to Paris or London, where it was quietly sold to finance anti-Bolshevik activities. Every theory has fragments of evidence but nothing definitive. You find yourself wondering if Alexandra would be satisfied knowing her tiara generated a century of mystery and speculation, or if she'd be heartbroken that something she loved so dearly ended up lost and forgotten. Probably both. Honestly, aristocratic melancholy tends toward complicated emotions. As you step away from this particular thread of the story, you can almost see the phantom shimmer of those 488 diamonds, still catching light in some unknown location, still beautiful, still cursed or blessed depending on who's telling the story, still waiting for someone to find them and finally solve the mystery of where Alexandra's crown disappeared to. You're standing in the Winter Palace on the night of October 25th, 1917, and the air crackles with revolutionary fervour mixed with barely controlled chaos. Outside, you can hear the distant rumble of crowds, the occasional crack of rifle fire, and the deep boom of the cruiser Aurora's guns signalling the beginning of the end for the Romanov world inside. The palace feels like a dying organism, lights flickering, servants fleeing through side doors, government ministers barricading themselves in offices while pretending everything is fine. And then the Bolsheviks arrive. They pour through the palace gates in waves, sailors from Kronstadt, factory workers from the Viborg district, soldiers who've abandoned their officers, all of them armed and angry and intoxicated by the moment. You watch as they surge through corridors that were designed to intimidate with their grandeur, past walls covered in silk damask and paintings by old masters, heading toward the prize everyone knows about but few have actually seen, the imperial treasure vaults. Some of these men are genuine ideological revolutionaries who believe they're seizing the people's stolen wealth. Others are opportunists who've been waiting their entire lives for a chance like this. Most are probably a confused mixture of both, swept up in events larger than individual motivation. The Vault Guards surrender without much fight, they're outnumbered 50-1. And besides, what exactly are they defending anymore? The Tsar has abdicated. The provisional government is collapsing. The old order is over, and shooting at armed revolutionaries to protect jewellery seems like a fast way to die for a cause that's already lost. So they step aside, and the Bolsheviks break through the reinforced doors using sledgehammers and pry bars, the metallic clanging echoing through the palace like a death knell for aristocratic Russia. What happens next depends on who's telling the story. The official Bolshevik version, recorded in party documents and Soviet histories, describes an orderly seizure of state property. Revolutionary Guards carefully inventoried everything, documented each piece, and transferred the jewels to secure state custody for the benefit of the people. The reality appears considerably messier. Contemporary accounts from people who were actually there, including some of the revolutionaries themselves, writing years later in émigré memoirs, describe scenes of barely controlled looting. Men stuffing diamonds into pockets, down boots, inside caps, necklaces getting tangled and broken as multiple hands grab for the same prize, tiaras shoved into military bags alongside ammunition and bread rations. One sailor allegedly tried to wear an empress's crown over his naval cap and got into a fistfight with a factory worker who wanted it instead. You follow a group into the main vault, watching them react to wealth beyond comprehension. Most of these men have never seen anything more valuable than a silver pocket watch. Suddenly they're surrounded by artifacts worth more than their entire neighbourhoods combined. Some respond with appropriate revolutionary anger. Look what they hoarded while we starved. But others just gape in wonder because beauty is beauty regardless of political consciousness. A young soldier picks up the Orloff diamond, weighs it in his palm, and whispers it's warm because he expected something so valuable to feel different, to somehow announce its importance through temperature or texture. Diamonds, unfortunately for dramatic symbolism, feel like slightly warm rocks. The chaos extends beyond simple theft. Revolutionaries who lack any expertise in jewellery start making catastrophically stupid decisions. Someone tries to pry diamonds out of a tiara using a bayonet, shattering several stones and rendering the piece significantly less valuable. Another group decides to liberate a massive emerald necklace by breaking it into individual stones, destroying both the historical significance and the premium value that comes from intact parures. There's a darkly comic moment when a worker tries to pocket what he thinks is a massive ruby, only to have a more knowledgeable comrade inform him it's actually coloured glass used as a placeholder in a display setting. The disappointment is visible even across a century of distance. Historians still argue about exactly how much was taken during those first chaotic nights versus how much was properly secured by Bolshevik authorities. The numbers are basically impossible to verify because the pre-revolutionary inventories were incomplete. The revolutionary inventories were conducted under less than ideal circumstances, and everyone involved had motivations to either inflate or minimise the losses depending on their political position. Conservative estimates suggest maybe 10 to 15% of the imperial diamonds disappeared during the October Revolution itself. More dramatic accounts claim up to 40% vanished. The truth probably sits somewhere in between, which is profoundly unsatisfying but historically typical. You're present 3 days later, when slightly more organised Soviet officials arrive to establish actual control over the remaining treasures. They're horrified by what they find: broken display cases, scattered paperwork, and a pile of lesser jewellery pieces worth mere thousands instead of millions abandoned in a corner like unwanted toys. A commissar named Grigory literally puts his head in his hands and groans. This is not how the revolution's supposed to work. His colleague, more pragmatic, starts immediately cataloguing what's left, working by candlelight because the palace electricity is intermittent. They'll spend the next 6 months trying to reconstruct what was taken, by whom, and where it went. They'll mostly fail. Some pieces get recovered quickly through surprisingly mundane means. A sailor tries to sell a diamond bracelet to a shopkeeper 3 blocks from the Winter Palace, and the shopkeeper who's seen enough revolution to know reporting theft might earn goodwill with new authorities turns him in. The sailor protests that he's a revolutionary hero and the jewellery belongs to the people, which technically includes him. So, really, what's the problem? The Soviet authorities execute him anyway, as an example, which seems harsh but does slow down the obvious looting somewhat, though not entirely, never entirely. You discover that some Bolshevik leaders weren't above keeping a few souvenirs themselves. Decades later, when Stalin conducts purges against old revolutionaries, investigators find imperial jewels hidden in apartments of party officials who are supposedly incorruptible ideologues. One commissar's wife is arrested wearing diamond earrings that match a missing pair from Grand Duchess Zenia's collection. Her defence that her husband found them in the street convinces exactly nobody. She disappears into the Gulag system, and the earrings disappear back into state custody, though even that trail eventually goes cold. The most brazen theft involves a complete diamond parure necklace, earrings, and tiara that vanishes from a locked cabinet despite guards stationed outside. Investigation reveals the guards were bribed with vodka and morphine by a group that included at least 2 Soviet officials, a former palace servant and an opportunistic locksmith. They made wax impressions of the keys weeks earlier and executed the heist with impressive professionalism. By the time authorities realize what happened, the thieves are already on trains heading to Moscow, Odessa, and points beyond. The parure will eventually surface decades later in a London auction house. But that's getting ahead of the story. You watch as the remaining diamonds get packed into crates and transported to Moscow for safekeeping in the Kremlin vaults, the same vaults you visited earlier, though now under very different management. The irony isn't lost on anyone. The Bolsheviks seized the Tsarist treasures, denounced them as symbols of oppression, and then lock them up in almost exactly the same way the Tsars did. Because valuable things require security regardless of who claims ownership. Revolutionary ideals meet practical reality, and practical reality wins every time. As the last crates leave the Winter Palace in January 1918, you notice something poignant. Scattered across the floor of the empty vault are dozens of tiny diamonds. Stones so small they fell from broken settings and weren't worth the effort of picking up amid the chaos. They catch the morning light coming through high windows. These forgotten fragments of imperial glory glitter uselessly on cold stone floors. A cleaning woman sweeps them up days later along with dust and debris, dumping everything into a bin without realizing she's literally throwing away gems. It's perhaps the perfect metaphor for how completely the revolution shattered the old order wealth, once guarded more carefully than human lives, now swept away as trash. You're in the Moscow Kremlin's Armory Museum in 1922 watching a very unusual scene unfold. Soviet officials stand in heated argument with museum curators over which imperial diamonds should be sold to raise hard currency for the struggling revolutionary state, and which should be preserved as historical treasures of the Russian people. It's a debate that would be philosophically fascinating if the stakes weren't so high. These men are literally deciding which fragments of the Romanov legacy survive and which get scattered to foreign collectors forever. The tension in the room is thick enough to cut with a knife. Or perhaps with a diamond-encrusted letter opener, if those hadn't all been earmarked for liquidation already. The chief curator, a surprisingly brave man named Nikolai Romanovich, argues passionately for preservation. He's not a secret monarchist, he genuinely believes in the revolution's ideals. But he also understands that these objects represent irreplaceable craftsmanship and historical significance that transcends political systems. These pieces tell Russia's story, he insists, gesturing at a display case containing Catherine the Great's jewellery. Sell them and we erase part of our national memory. Future generations will curse us for trading their heritage for temporary financial relief. It's a compelling argument, and you can see several officials nodding despite themselves. The counter-argument comes from Aaron Scheinman, the People's Commissar for Finance, who has the unenviable job of funding a government that broke, isolated by international sanctions, and still fighting multiple civil war fronts. Comrade Curator, we appreciate historical sentiment, but people are starving. We need grain, medicine, industrial equipment, things that require foreign currency. These diamonds can purchase tractors for collective farms. They can buy machinery for factories. Or they can sit in cases being pretty while peasants die. When he puts it that way, the curators don't have much moral ground to stand on, and they know it. The compromise they reach shapes what survives to the present day truly unique historical pieces, coronation crowns, items with specific connections to major historical events, and jewels with exceptional artistic or technical merit remain in state museums. Everything else is fair game for sale. It sounds reasonable in theory, but implementation proves magnificently subjective. What counts as exceptional artistic merit? Who decides which pieces have sufficient historical significance? The criteria shift depending on who's making decisions on any given day, and whether they had breakfast, and whether the current political winds favour preserving heritage or raising revenue. You watch as curators work frantically to save specific pieces by exaggerating their historical importance. They create elaborate documentation proving that unremarkable diamond bracelets were worn at crucial moments in Russian history. They argue that certain necklaces represent pinnacle technical achievements that must be preserved for future jewelers to study. Some of this is genuine scholarship. Some is creative fiction designed to protect beauty from bureaucratic destruction. Historians still argue whether these curators were heroes preserving cultural heritage or elitist obstacles to revolutionary progress. Probably both. Honestly, history rarely offers simple moral categories. The pieces that survive this selection process become the core of what's now called the Diamond Fund, a collection housed in the Kremlin Armory that tourists can visit today. You examine what made the cut the Orlov diamond, because it's connected to Catherine the Great and impressive enough that selling it would be embarrassing. The Shah diamond, because the Persian inscriptions make it culturally significant beyond mere monetary value. The imperial crown, because destroying your own symbol of sovereignty seems like bad optics even for revolutionaries, and dozens of other pieces that got lucky right curator argued at the right moment, or the bureaucrat reviewing their case had a romantic streak, or the paperwork got filed in the correct office instead of the liquidation office. But here's the quirky detail that rarely makes it into official histories: some pieces survived, purely by accident through bureaucratic incompetence. The Soviet system, for all its revolutionary fervour, was still Russian bureaucracy at its core, which means paperwork disappeared, items got miscatalogued, and things fell through cracks wide enough to drive trucks through. A diamond tiara listed as sent to liquidation commission in 1923 turns up in museum storage in 1935, and nobody can explain how or why. A set of emerald and diamond jewellery marked for sale appears in an inventory conducted in 1928, despite records showing it was sold to a Berlin dealer in 1925. Either the sale never happened, or different emerald set was sold under the same description, or someone is lying in official documents. Good luck figuring out which. You follow one specific piece, the small imperial crown, created for Empress Maria Alexandrovna, and containing nearly 1/500 diamonds through its bureaucratic odyssey. It's initially tagged for preservation in 1920. Then in 1921 a finance official adds it to the liquidation list because the country desperately needs money. A curator appeals, arguing its historical significance. And it's moved back to preservation in 1922. Then in 1923 Stalin himself reviews budget numbers and personally marks it for sale because he needs funds for industrial projects, at which point the curator does something remarkably brave and possibly insane. He loses the crown by moving it to a storage room and conveniently forgetting to update the location in official records. The crown isn't found again until 1927, by which point the immediate financial crisis has passed and nobody bothers adding it back to the sales list. The curator's strategic incompetence saves an irreplaceable artifact. Other curators employ similar creative preservation strategies. They mix up item numbers so liquidation lists reference the wrong pieces. They claim items are undergoing conservation and therefore unavailable for sale. Then stretch the conservation timeline for years. They write appraisals that dramatically undervalue pieces, making them seem not worth the effort of selling internationally. It's guerrilla archivism fighting to preserve heritage using bureaucracy's own weapons of confusion and delay. Some get caught and punished. Others succeed and never tell anyone what they did, taking their small acts of resistance to their graves. You're present in 1924 when the Armory Museum officially opens to the public as a museum of the people's reclaimed treasures. Soviet citizens line up to see what their former oppressors hoarded, and reactions are mixed. Some visitors express appropriate revolutionary anger. Look what they wasted while we suffered. Others simply stare in wonder because beautiful things inspire wonder regardless of political context. And a few older visitors weep quietly, mourning a world that's gone forever. But they keep their tears discreet because nostalgia for the old regime can be dangerous in 1924. The museum becomes an odd sort of compromise the diamonds survive. But their meaning is inverted. Instead of symbols of imperial power and glory, they're now displayed as evidence of aristocratic excess and exploitation. The labels explain how many peasants laboured to pay for each piece, how much grain could have been purchased instead, how the wealth of the few came at the expense of the many. It's historically accurate, but also feels like the world's most expensive guilt trip. You wonder what Catherine the Great would think, knowing her beloved collection survived but is now used to condemn everything she represented. By 1930, the selection process is complete. Roughly 30 to 40% of the original imperial diamond collection remains in Soviet state museums. The rest has been sold, stolen, lost, destroyed, or mysteriously vanished into the vast uncertainty of revolutionary chaos. The pieces that survive do so through a combination of genuine historical merit, curatorial courage, bureaucratic confusion, and sheer dumb luck. They sit in their cases, still brilliant, still beautiful, now serving very different purposes than their creators intended. The survivors are the lucky ones, though luck is relative when you're a diamond that's witnessed revolution, civil war, and the complete overthrow of the social order that created you. You leave the Armory Museum as evening falls over Moscow, and through the windows you catch the last light reflecting off the preserved diamonds. They glow with the same cold fire they've always had, indifferent to politics, economics, and human suffering. In that indifference lies perhaps their greatest power. They outlast ideologies, empires, and revolutions, remaining stubbornly beautiful long after everything else turns to dust. You're in a smoky back room of a Parisian hotel in 1928 watching one of the strangest business transactions of the 20th century unfold. On one side of the table sits a nervous Soviet trade representative named Mikhail, sweating despite the cool evening air, with the leather case handcuffed to his wrist. On the other side lounges an elegantly dressed gem dealer named Solomon, examining a diamond necklace through a jeweller's loupe with the casual expertise of someone who's handled millions in precious stones. Between them lies the uncomfortable reality of early Soviet economics. The revolution seized vast wealth but can't eat it, wear it, or use it to build factories. Diamonds must become dollars, and that requires negotiating with exactly the kind of capitalist parasites the revolution supposedly overthrew. The irony is not lost on anyone in the room. Stalin has ordered a systematic liquidation of imperial treasures to finance his ambitious industrialization plans. The Soviet Union needs tractors, machine tools, electrical generators, and technical expertise, none of which can be purchased with diamonds, no matter how spectacular. So the diamonds must be converted to hard currency, which means dealing with international gem markets that are deeply suspicious of Soviet goods. Nobody wants to publicly admit they're buying jewellery that might have been pried off a murdered Grand Duchess's neck, but everybody wants the stones if the price is right. It's capitalism at its most hypocritical, and you're watching it happen in real time. The operation runs through multiple channels to avoid flooding the market and crashing prices. the Soviet trade mission Antiquariat handles official sales, working through established auction houses and dealers who maintain plausible deniability about provenance. They describe pieces as from an important private collection, or formerly in a European royal house, which is technically true while being deliberately vague about specifics. Then there are semi-official channels, trusted intermediaries who take commissions to quietly move pieces to private collectors who prefer discretion. And finally, there's the black market stolen items sold by the original thieves, or by second and third-hand dealers who acquired them through murky chains of transaction that nobody investigates too closely. You follow Solomon as he examines the necklace Mikhail is offering, 265 diamonds in a graduated Riviere design. Once belonging to Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, it's a spectacular piece, easily worth $200,000 in current markets, maybe more, but Solomon offers $75,000 and you watch Mikhail's face fall. That's robbery, the Soviet representative protests. This necklace is museum quality, the stones alone are worth. Solomon cuts him off with a weary gesture. Comrade, I'm not arguing about intrinsic value. I'm talking about what I can actually sell this for without attracting uncomfortable questions. Imperial Russian provenance decreases value right now, not increases it. Too controversial. Too many lawyers asking about rightful ownership. Historians still argue about exactly how much the Soviets realized from these sales versus what the pieces were actually worth. Soviet records claim they received fair market value and that Western dealers were respectful partners in mutually beneficial transactions. Western sources suggest the Soviets were desperate sellers who got systematically lowballed by dealers who understood they had no other options. The truth, as usual, probably involves both dynamics plus a healthy dose of ordinary corruption skimming proceeds at multiple points in the chain. The biggest player in this game is a Belgian dealer named Alexander Polovtsov, who somehow maintains relationships with both Soviet trade officials and wealthy Western collectors despite those groups theoretically despising each other. You watch him operate at a London auction in 1929 bidding on a diamond tiara that everyone in the room knows is Romanov, but that the catalogue carefully describes as Russian imperial style, circa 1900. Polovtsov wins with a bid that's simultaneously high enough to beat competitors, but low enough that he'll make substantial profit when he resells to an American client next month. He's threading a needle between markets, and he's very, very good at it. Some sales become semi-public scandals. In 1927, the British Museum purchases what they believe is a Byzantine diamond cross, only for Russian émigrés to recognise it as having come from the Moscow Kremlin's collection. Newspapers explode with outrage. British Museum buys looted treasures. The museum defensively claims they had no way of knowing the provenance, which is obviously false. The piece had been published in pre-revolutionary catalogues. But what can they do? Return it to the Soviets and admit they essentially funded the Bolshevik regime, keep it, and look like they're trafficking in stolen goods? They choose to keep it but stop publicly acquiring pieces with obvious Russian origins, which merely drives the trade further underground. The Soviet liquidation includes some breathtakingly cynical moments. In 1930, they auction a diamond-encrusted icon of the Virgin of Kazan, a piece that's simultaneously valuable as jewellery and sacred as a religious object. The winning bidder is an Orthodox Church representative who's assembled donations from émigré communities specifically to rescue the icon from atheist desecration. The Soviets cheerfully accept the money, which means Orthodox believers essentially funded Soviet industrialization to save a religious artifact from the regime they're trying to escape. The whole situation is so perfectly ironic it could be a dark comedy if the stakes weren't so high. But here's the quirky detail that rarely gets told. Some pieces got sold, then resold, then sold again in a bizarre carousel of transactions that suggest money laundering or fraud or both. A diamond bracelet appears in a Paris auction in 1928, sells to an anonymous buyer, then shows up in a Berlin sale in 1929 being offered by a different anonymous seller. Either someone bought it, immediately regretted the purchase, and flipped it for a loss, or something shadier is happening. Some researchers believe Soviet intelligence used jewellery sales to move money for espionage operations, purchasing their own pieces through intermediaries to create legitimate-looking financial transactions that disguised spy funding. Is this true? Maybe. Can it be proven? Not really. But it would explain some very weird patterns in the sales records. You're present at a 1932 meeting in Moscow where Soviet officials review their liquidation efforts. They've raised approximately $12, $15 million from diamond sales, a substantial sum, but far less than the treasures were theoretically worth. Stalin is predictably unhappy with the numbers, demanding to know why they didn't get better prices. The officials explain market dynamics, risk management, and the challenges of selling hot merchandise, which Stalin dismisses as capitalist propaganda and excuses for poor negotiating. 3 of the officials involved in the program disappear into the Gulag system within 6 months, accused of sabotaging the Soviet economy by underselling national treasures. Their replacements are even more desperate to meet quotas, which leads to even worse deals with even shadier intermediaries. The sales continue throughout the 1930s, slowing down but never quite stopping. Every time the Soviet Union needs hard currency, and it always needs hard currency, another few pieces get quietly released through established channels. A tiara here, a necklace there. Loose stones when fully assembled pieces might be too recognizable. It's death by 1,000 cuts for the imperial collection. Each sale further scattering the concentrated glory of 3 centuries, and with each sale, the chances of ever reuniting or even cataloguing the complete collection diminish, as pieces disappear into private collections that guard their provenance secrets with lawyers and silence. By 1940, with war approaching, the liquidation essentially ends. The Soviets have sold off everything they're willing to part with, and international markets are focused on more immediate concerns than luxury goods. What remains in Soviet custody stays there, increasingly valuable as scarcity drives up prices for Imperial Russian pieces. The dealers who participated in the original sales, those who survived, anyway, never talk publicly about their role. It's bad for business to advertise that you helped liquidate looted treasures, even if that looting was done by governments rather than individual thieves. The whole operation fades into the grey zone where official history is sparse and participants maintain strategic silence. You find yourself wondering about the ethics of these transactions. Were the dealers who bought from the Soviets engaging in legitimate commerce or fencing stolen goods? Were they helping preserve cultural artifacts by moving them to stable collections? Or were they profiting from revolution and murder? The answer is probably both, which is uncomfortable but historically typical. Clean hands are rare in the gem trade, and the Romanov diamonds changed hands at a moment when everyone involved had motives they'd rather not examine too closely. You're standing in a climate-controlled vault in Geneva in 1935, surrounded by velvet-lined trays containing some of the most heart-breaking absences in jewellery history. Each tray should hold a complete parure-matching necklace, earrings, tiara, bracelet, and brooch, but instead you're looking at orphan pieces, the jewellery equivalent of separated families. Here's a tiara with no matching necklace. There's a bracelet whose companion earrings vanish somewhere between St. Petersburg and Paris. A spectacular brooch that once anchored a set so magnificent it had its own name, the Aurora Parure, now sits alone, its siblings scattered to unknown fates across 3 continents. The tragedy of the disappeared parures is that they were worth exponentially more together than apart. A complete matching set, created over years with carefully selected stones cut to complement each other. represents the pinnacle of jewellery craftsmanship. Break it up and you have individual pieces that are certainly valuable. But you've destroyed something irreplaceable, the unified vision, the artistic coherence, the historical integrity. It's like taking a symphony and selling off individual instruments. You still have valuable objects, but you've murdered the music. You examine the documentation on Empress Maria Alexandrovna's emerald and diamond parure, which you glimpsed intact earlier in the Moscow vault. The set contained 7 pieces tiara, necklace, 2 bracelets, earrings, brooch, and a devant de corsage, basically a chest ornament. Pre-revolutionary photographs show Maria wearing the complete ensemble, and the effect is stunning. A cascading arrangement of matched Colombian emeralds surrounded by diamond frames that create an illusion of green fire contained in ice. Post-revolution, the set fragments immediately. The tiara goes to antiquariat for official sale. The necklace disappears during the Winter Palace chaos, presumably stolen. One bracelet sells through a Paris dealer in 1927. The other bracelet's fate is completely unknown. The earrings surface in a London auction in 1931 purchased by an American collector who has no idea they're part of a set. The brooch and corsage ornament simply vanish from records entirely. Historians still argue about whether the Soviets deliberately broke up parures to maximize profit, separate pieces being easier to sell than massive sets, or whether the fragmenting happened through the chaos of multiple thefts, sales, and transactions conducted by people who didn't understand or care about keeping sets intact. Evidence exists for both scenarios. Some Soviet documents explicitly discuss separating matching pieces because individual items attract less attention and suspicion than complete imperial sets. But other breakups clearly resulted from opportunistic theft, where looters grabbed whatever they could carry without regard for artistic unity. You follow the trail of Grand Duchess Vladimir's sapphire parure, one of the most spectacular sets in the collection. Maria Pavlovna, known as Vladimir's Duchess, commissioned it in 1900 from Berlin, using cashmere sapphires so deeply blue they appear almost purple in certain light. The original set included 15 pieces: tiara, necklace, 2 bracelets, earrings, brooch, stomacher, 4 hair ornaments, 2 bracelets, and a ring. It took 3 years to assemble matched stones of sufficient quality when worn together at the 1903 Winter Palace Ball. The ensemble allegedly made Alexandra Fyodorovna so jealous she left early, claiming a headache, after the revolution. Vladimir herself, one of the few Romanovs to successfully escape Russia, sends a trusted friend back to St. Petersburg on a desperate retrieval mission. The friend, posing as British diplomat, somehow talks his way into the sealed Vladimir Palace and recovers 2 trunks of jewellery that the family had hidden behind a false wall. This is either the gutsiest heist or the luckiest diplomatic bluff in history, depending on how you interpret the evidence. The trunks make it to England, where Vladimir has fled, and she sells some pieces to support herself in exile. But here's the thing, she only recovers part of the sapphire parure. The tiara, necklace, and 1 bracelet make it to England. Everything else was already gone, taken during earlier looting or possibly even stolen by staff before the family fled. Vladimir sells the tiara to Queen Mary of England in 1921, and it remains in the British Royal Collection today, though Mary had it adapted to accept different stones because apparently 1 magnificent tiara isn't enough. You need a convertible version that works with multiple gem options. The necklace Vladimir keeps, and it eventually passes to her daughter, who sells it in the 1950s to a private collector. And that bracelet, it shows up in an auction catalogue in 1967 misidentified as Russian imperial style, and sells for a fraction of what it would command if the auction house understood its actual provenance. The remaining pieces of the 15-piece set, 12 items worth millions, are simply gone, vanished, probably broken apart for the stones, or sitting in collections where owners don't know what they have. You discover a particularly poignant case in the record's Empress Alexandra's diamond and pearl drop parure, a wedding gift from her sister. The set originally contained matching pieces designed around a specific pattern diamonds, forming floral motifs with pearl drops. It was personal, sentimental, relatively understated by imperial standards. After 1917, the pieces scatter like dandelion seeds. A pearl and diamond brooch surfaces in a Stockholm estate sale in 1923. A pair of earrings appears in a Copenhagen auction in 1929. Individual pearl drops show up for sale in various locations throughout the 1930s, removed from their diamond settings and sold as loose gems. Someone, somewhere, took apart Alexandra's wedding gift piece by piece and distributed it across Europe without any regard for its history or meaning. You can't decide if this is tragic or simply the logical endpoint of treating sentimental objects as commodities. The most frustrating disappeared parure is the so-called Pink Diamond Suite, a set commissioned by Catherine II, using rare pink diamonds from Indian mines. Pre-revolutionary inventories describe it in mouth-watering detail: 37 pink diamonds of matched colour, set with white diamonds in rose gold, comprising tiara, necklace, earrings, and 2 bracelets. The total weight is listed as 187 carats of pink diamonds alone. This set would be worth tens of millions. Today, pink diamonds are exponentially rarer and more valuable than white. But after 1917, the Pink Diamond Suite simply evaporates. Not a single piece has been definitively identified in any collection, auction, or museum. Either it was completely destroyed and the stones recut beyond recognition, or it's sitting in someone's vault and the owner is keeping very, very quiet about it. Some partial reunifications happen through accident or determination. In 1978, a jewellery collector in New York realises that a tiara he purchased years ago and a necklace he recently acquired at auction have matching design elements and similar construction techniques. He contacts the auction house, which investigates and confirms both pieces came from Grand Duchess Xenia's aquamarine parure. The collector manages to track down and purchase one of the bracelets from the set at a European auction in 1982. He spends the rest of his life trying to find the remaining pieces: another bracelet, earrings, and a brooch, but dies without success. His collection goes to a museum, where the 3 reunited pieces are displayed together with a placard explaining what's missing. It's a small victory against the forces of dispersal, but mostly it just emphasises everything that's lost. Historians and jewellery enthusiasts maintain databases trying to track parure fragments, matching characteristics like stone cuts, metalwork, and design motifs to reunite separated pieces, at least on paper. It's detective work that requires expertise in gemology, art history, and genealogy, plus access to archives scattered across multiple countries and languages. And even when they identify matches, there's often nothing to be done. The pieces belong to different owners who may not know about each other, may not care about reunification, or may not want to reveal they own Imperial Russian jewellery, because questions about provenance lead to uncomfortable legal and ethical territory. You find yourself in a peculiar position, surrounded by beautiful, valuable jewellery that's simultaneously present and absent. The physical objects exist somewhere, probably, but their identity as parts of greater wholes has been erased. They're like amnesia victims, functional, even impressive, but disconnected from their own history. And with each passing year, the chances of meaningful reunification decrease as memories fade, records disappear, and the people who might remember seeing complete sets die off. The disappeared parures become mythology, stories we tell about a more complete past, forever out of reach but never quite forgotten. You're in the elegant Parisian showroom of Cartier in 1925 watching Pierre Cartier examine a diamond tiara with the kind of focused intensity surgeons reserve for delicate operations. The tiara sits on black velvet under carefully positioned lamps, its diamonds catching light and throwing prismatic sparkles across the room's silk-covered walls. Pierre's expression is difficult to read, part fascination, part calculation, part something that might be moral discomfort. He knows exactly what he's looking at: a Romanov piece, almost certainly looted during the Revolution, being offered to him by a dealer whose credentials are impeccable but whose actual supply chain is murky at best. The question isn't whether to buy it. The question is whether buying it makes Cartier complicit in something dark, or whether it's simply good business in complicated times. The famous jewellery house finds itself in an ethical quandary that defines the 1920s luxury market. Russian imperial jewellery is flooding European markets, some through official Soviet channels, some through private sellers who may be dispossessed aristocrats or maybe sophisticated fencers, and honestly, telling the difference is nearly impossible. Cartier has built its reputation on quality, craftsmanship, and discretion. That discretion suddenly feels less like professional courtesy and more like willful blindness when applied to jewellery that might have literally been pried from a murdered Grand Duchess's safe. But if Cartier doesn't buy these pieces, competitors will, and the stones will end up in the same place regardless of Cartier's moral stance. So what's the right choice Pierre decides to buy, but with conditions that salve his conscience, if not actually solving the ethical problem? Cartier will purchase imperial pieces, but they'll be substantially reworked before resale stones reset in modern designs, old settings melted down, any identifying characteristics of Romanov origin erased. This serves multiple purposes. It makes the pieces less recognizable and therefore less likely to attract legal challenges from Romanov descendants or Soviet officials. It transforms looted antiques into new Cartier creations, and it allows Cartier to mark up prices significantly because customers are paying for Cartier design, not just inherited gems. Historians still argue whether this was ethical pragmatism or profitable rationalization dressed up as propriety. You watch as Cartier's craftsmen disassemble a magnificent diamond necklace that once belonged to Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna. The original piece featured a distinctive Byzantine-inspired design with double-headed eagle motifs, unmistakably Imperial Russian. The craftsmen carefully remove each diamond, catalogue the stones by size and quality, melt down the platinum settings, and begin creating an entirely new Art Deco design that reflects current Paris fashion, rather than St. Petersburg's vanished world. When finished, the necklace bears no trace of its origin. It's been reborn as a purely French creation, though the diamonds themselves carry memories in their atomic structure that no redesign can erase. The transformation process isn't just aesthetic, it's also legal protection. In the 1920s, legal ownership of Imperial Russian jewellery is a nightmare. The Romanov descendants claim rightful ownership. The Soviet government claims everything as state property. The people who actually possess the pieces claim ownership by purchase or, occasionally, by theft they prefer not to discuss. Courts across Europe issue contradictory rulings about who owns what. By completely reworking pieces, Cartier creates legal distance. This is a Cartier necklace created in 1926, not a Romanov artifact from 1890. Whether that distinction would hold up under serious legal scrutiny is questionable. But nobody really wants to test it in court because all parties have secrets they'd prefer to keep secret. Cartier isn't alone in this practice. Van Cleef and Arpels, Boucheron, and other major houses engage in similar transformations. But Cartier becomes particularly associated with Romanov diamonds because of their relationship with the Grand Duchess Vladimir's daughter, Marie Pavlovna. After escaping Russia and recovering some of her mother's jewellery through that remarkable diplomatic heist, Marie essentially partners with Cartier, selling them pieces and providing authentication that certain stones are indeed from imperial collections. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. Marie gets money to live on. Cartier gets prestigious provenance they can discreetly mention to high-end clients who want to own royal diamonds, even if they're reset in modern styles. But here's the controversial part that makes some historians uncomfortable. Did Cartier know they were sometimes buying from dealers who'd obtained pieces through Soviet liquidation sales? Almost certainly yes. Did they care? Apparently not enough to stop buying. Documents in Cartier's archives, examined decades later, show correspondence with dealers who explicitly mentioned Soviet sources. One 1928 letter casually notes that our Russian contacts have access to additional imperial items should these stones prove satisfactory. That's not exactly subtle. Cartier was buying from the Soviet government, directly or through intermediaries, while simultaneously buying from escaped aristocrats, while also potentially buying from thieves, and apparently saw no contradiction in supporting all three supply chains simultaneously. The most famous Cartier Romanov transformation involves the purchase of Grand Duchess Vladimir's sapphire and diamond tiara, the one that made it to England with Vladimir herself. After her death, her heirs sell it to Queen Mary through Cartier as an intermediary in 1921, but Cartier first purchases another Romanov piece of diamond, and pearl tiara of uncertain origin dismantles it completely, and creates an entirely new design that they sell to an American railroad heiress in 1922. The heiress wears it to society events in New York, proudly telling friends she owns Russian crown jewels, which is technically true but missing so much context it borders on fiction. She has no idea which Romanov owned it, under what circumstances it left Russia, or what it originally looked like. She just knows it's expensive and has a romantic story. You're present at a private Cartier showing in 1927 where they unveil a new collection explicitly marketed as incorporating imperial Russian diamonds. The showroom is decorated with somewhat cartoonish Russian motif samovars, icons, matryoshka dolls creating an exotic atmosphere that's more Orientalist fantasy than historical accuracy. Wealthy clients circulate with champagne, admiring pieces that Cartier describes as containing stones from the collection of Russian royalty. They're not lying exactly, but they're also not providing details about how those stones got from St. Petersburg palaces to Paris showrooms. The clients don't ask uncomfortable questions, and Cartier doesn't volunteer uncomfortable answers, and everyone goes home happy with their beautiful blood-tainted jewellery. Historians still argue about whether Cartier's actions help preserve imperial jewellery by transforming it into forms that could survive in modern markets, or whether they were simply profiting from tragedy with a thin veneer of aesthetic justification. The company line, articulated in various memoirs and company histories, is that Cartier rescued these pieces from destruction by giving them new life in contemporary settings. Critics counter that Cartier destroyed irreplaceable historical artifacts for profit, erasing provenance and context to avoid legal and ethical complications. Both perspectives have merit, which is why the debate continues. The practice creates an interesting problem for modern jewellery historians. How many supposedly Cartier original pieces from the 1920s and 1930s actually contain Romanov diamonds in disguise? The company's records are incomplete, either through genuine loss over time or strategic discretion about sensitive transactions. Gemologists can sometimes identify stones by examining characteristics that survive resetting, but diamonds are pretty uniform objects, making definitive identification difficult unless you have extensive documentation about the original pieces. This means museums and collectors who own Cartier Art Deco jewellery might be unknowingly housing fragments of the Romanov collection, transformed beyond recognition. By the mid-1930s, as the supply of available imperial pieces dwindles and the initial revolutionary chaos fades into memory, Cartier gradually stops explicitly marketing Russian provenance. The exotic appeal diminishes as newer generations care less about vanished empires and more about contemporary design. The transformed pieces just become vintage Cartier, their origin stories fading into footnotes if they are remembered at all. And perhaps that's the real tragedy, not just the physical transformation of the jewellery, but the erasure of memory, the severing of connection between object and history. The diamonds survive, brilliant and beautiful, but their stories die, which is perhaps the ultimate victory for those who wanted to erase the Romanov legacy entirely. You're at a glittering Manhattan society ball in 1929, champagne flowing freely despite prohibition, jazz band playing something scandalously modern, and you're watching the American elite parade their wealth with abandon because the stock market crash is still 8 months away and nobody sees it coming. Among the crowd, you notice several women wearing spectacular diamond jewellery that catches light with particular brilliance. That tiara on Barbara Hutton. The Woolworth heiress, those diamonds have an unusual cut, a specific clarity that seems almost too perfect. That necklace draped across Marjorie Merriweather-Post's neck. Catching fire in the chandelier light, the setting is modern Art Deco, but the stones themselves have a depth and quality that speaks to older origins. And you realise with a strange jolt these American heiresses are wearing Romanov diamonds, and they probably have no idea. The pathway from Russian palace to American ballroom is surprisingly straightforward once you understand the economics of the 1920s. America emerges from World War I as the world's dominant economic power, while Europe is devastated and broke. American industrialists and financiers have accumulated unprecedented wealth, and nowhere particularly interesting to spend it. Meanwhile, Europe has flooded markets with imperial Russian jewellery pieces that are magnificent, but carry complicated provenance that makes European aristocrats hesitant to purchase them. Enter the American nouveau riche, who lack the historical baggage of European nobility and see Russian imperial jewellery not as tragic reminders of murdered cousins, but as exotic status symbols that prove you've made it to the top tier of wealth. You follow a specific necklace's journey from St. Petersburg to Pittsburgh. Originally created for Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna in 1910, the piece features 73 diamonds arranged in a delicate platinum web, designed by the court jeweller Fabergé himself. After the revolution, it disappears into the chaos, presumably stolen during palace looting. It surfaces in Berlin in 1923, offered by a dealer whose acquisition story is suspiciously vague. A Paris jeweller purchases it, makes minor modifications to the clasp, and sells it to an intermediary in London. From London, it travels to New York, where a dealer specialising in European antique jewellery markets it to Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary and one of America's richest men, as an anniversary gift for his wife. The price is $85,000, enormous by 1920s standards, but Mellon barely blinks. His wife wears it to a White House dinner, where newspapers photograph her, and the necklace appears in society pages as Mrs. Mellon's stunning new European diamond piece. Nobody mentions Romanovs or revolutions or theft. That would be tacky. The American market for these pieces operates on strategic ignorance. Dealers know perfectly well they're selling imperial Russian jewellery. but they carefully avoid documenting or advertising specific Romanov connections, because that raises uncomfortable questions. Instead, they use euphemisms from an important European collection, or formerly belonging to continental royalty, or simply Russian provenance. American buyers understand the implication these are crown jewels from fallen monarchies, but the vague language provides plausible deniability if anyone ever asks directly. And nobody asks directly, because wealth buys discretion, and discretion means everyone can enjoy their beautiful things without confronting how those things got here. Historians still argue about whether these American purchasers were naive innocents who genuinely didn't understand they were buying looted treasures, or sophisticated collectors who knew exactly what they were getting but didn't care, as long as the price was right and the legal risk was minimal. The truth probably varies by individual. Some buyers were genuinely clueless jewellery was just jewellery, and if Cartier or Tiffany sold it, it must be legitimate. Others were more knowing but rationalised their purchases. The Romanovs were dead. The jewellery would be sold to someone regardless, and at least American buyers would preserve and appreciate these pieces rather than letting them be melted down for scrap. And some probably just didn't care about ethics when faced with the opportunity to own diamonds that once adorned empresses. You watch Barbara Hutton, one of the wealthiest women in America, and profoundly unhappy, despite or because of it accumulating jewellery with obsessive intensity. Her collection eventually includes at least a dozen pieces with confirmed or suspected Romanov origins. She purchases them through various dealers, pays top dollar without negotiating, and wears them to parties where photographers capture every angle. When someone eventually asks if her jewellery might be from the Russian Imperial collection, she responds with practiced vagueness. I believe some pieces may have European royal connections, but jewellery has such complicated histories, don't you think? Translation, yes, and I don't want to discuss it. Marjorie Merriweather Post takes a different approach. The post-serial fortune heiress becomes obsessed with Russian art and culture, eventually amassing one of the finest collections of Imperial Russian decorative arts outside Russia itself. She buys Romanov jewellery deliberately, sometimes even researching provenance to confirm imperial connections before purchasing. Her logic is preservationist. These pieces represent incredible craftsmanship and historical significance that the Soviets are destroying or selling off, so American collectors have a duty to rescue and preserve them. Whether this is genuine cultural appreciation or self-serving rationalization is debatable, probably both. But the result is that Post preserves pieces that might otherwise have been broken up or lost. But here's the quirky detail that rarely makes society pages. Some of these American heiresses are wearing diamonds that belong to women who died violently in the Revolution, and they're completely clueless about the specific tragedies attached to their jewellery. That tiara might have been Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna's, who was thrown alive down a mineshaft by Bolsheviks. Those earrings could have belonged to one of Alexandra's daughters, murdered in that Ekaterinburg basement. The jewellery carries no visible trauma. Diamonds don't absorb horror, but the disconnect between the original owner's fate and the current owner's privilege is jarring when you know both stories. You're present at a particularly surreal moment in 1931 when two American society women attend the same Metropolitan Opera opening night, both wearing tiaras from the same original Romanov parure, neither aware they're wearing matching pieces. The set had been broken up and sold separately through different dealers, transformed slightly by different jewellers, and purchased by different families. A Russian émigré in the audience recognizes both pieces and nearly faints from the shock of seeing separated sisters reunited accidentally across two oblivious American heads. She tells her friends, the story circulates through émigré communities, but it never reaches the actual owners, who continue wearing their tiaras in happy ignorance. The American purchase of Romanov diamonds has an interesting side effect. It helps establish American luxury markets as globally significant. Before World War I, wealthy Americans travelled to Paris or London to buy serious jewellery. After the war, European dealers increasingly come to America, bringing their finest pieces to New York, Newport and Palm Beach. The Romanov liquidation accelerates this shift if you want to sell imperial Russian diamonds. You go where the money is, and by 1925 the money is in America, within a generation. New York rivals Paris as a centre for high-end jewellery sales, partly because American customers demonstrated they'd pay top dollar for prestigious pieces regardless of complicated provenance. By the late 1930s, the initial wave of Romanov jewellery has been absorbed into American collections. Some pieces remain in the families that purchased them, passed down as heirlooms with increasingly vague origin stories. Others get resold as financial situations change or tastes evolve, entering the secondary market where they're purchased by newer generations of collectors who often have no idea what they're buying beyond vintage diamond jewellery. And some eventually find their way to museums when owners donate collections, where researchers sometimes discover that anonymous donation of early 20th century diamond tiara is actually a long-lost piece from Grand Duchess so-and-so's personal collection. The American chapter of the Romanov diamond story is fundamentally about transformation, not just of the jewellery itself, but of meaning. What were symbols of imperial power become symbols of American wealth, Nadan. What were markers of dynasty and tradition become fashionable accessories for people whose grandparents were middle-class shopkeepers. The disconnect is almost absurd. Diamonds that witness the height of Tsarist autocracy now attend Broadway opening nights and Gilded Age lawn parties, participating in a completely different kind of aristocracy. And somehow, the diamonds don't care. They sparkle the same regardless of who wears them or what empire has fallen to put them there. You're in a dusty London auction house in 1955 examining a lot that's just been withdrawn from sale minutes before the hammer falls. The piece in question is a diamond bracelet, elegant and expensive, catalogued as Russian imperial style, circa 1900. But something about it caught the wrong person's attention specifically. A sharp-eyed Russian émigré who recognised the piece from pre-revolutionary photographs and immediately contacted the auction house claiming it's stolen property. Now 3 different parties are arguing ownership. The consignor, who insists they purchased it legitimately in Paris 20 years ago. The émigré community claiming it belongs to Romanov descendants. And somewhere in the background, the Soviet government's lawyers suggesting it's state property illegally removed from Russia. Welcome to the authentication nightmare that defines the post-war Romanov diamond market. The problem is, straightforward thousands of pieces of Imperial Russian jewellery entered international markets between 1917 and 1940 through various legal, semi-legal, and thoroughly illegal channels. By the 1950s, documentation is sparse, memories are unreliable, and anyone with motivation to fake provenance has had decades to create convincing forgeries. The market floods with pieces claiming Romanov connections, and separating authentic imperial jewellery from clever fakes becomes nearly impossible without extensive expertise and documentation that often doesn't exist. You're watching the birth of an entire cottage industry, Romanov authentication specialists, provenance researchers, and unfortunately, skilled forgers who understand the market will pay premium prices for anything with a romantic Russian royal backstory. The fake market operates on multiple levels of sophistication. At the bottom, You have obviously fake pieces costume jewellery with fake stones and deliberately aged settings, sold to tourists or naive collectors who want to own a piece of Russian history without spending serious money. These are harmless annoyances, easily spotted by anyone with basic gemological knowledge. More problematic are pieces using real diamonds in fake settings, genuine stones arranged in approximations of imperial designs based on photographs, then artificially aged and given fictional provenance stories. These can fool casual collectors and even some dealers. But the really sophisticated fakes are something else entirely. You follow the work of a master forger operating in Paris throughout the 1950s and 60s. His name remains unknown because he was never caught. But his pieces occasionally surface and get debunked by modern testing. This craftsman uses period-appropriate materials, platinum and gold with correct purity levels for early 1900s Russian work. Diamonds that actually came from pre-war stocks, settings created using historical techniques rather than modern methods. He studies photographs of imperial jewellery obsessively, recreating pieces that were documented but disappeared, or creating variations on known designs. The result is jewellery that's genuinely old, genuinely valuable, and completely fake in terms of imperial provenance, yet passes most authentication tests available in that era. Historians still argue about what percentage of authenticated Romanov jewellery in private collections is actually imperial versus skillfully faked. Estimates range from 30% to 70% fake, which is a hilariously wide range that tells you how uncertain the experts are. The challenge is that authentication requires comparing pieces to documentation, but documentation is incomplete, scattered across multiple archives in multiple countries, and sometimes deliberately destroyed or falsified. You can't always prove a piece is fake even when you are quite sure it is, because absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence when records are this compromised. The situation gets worse when supposedly reputable experts start authenticating fakes, either through incompetence or corruption. You watch a well-known Russian art specialist in London certify a diamond tiara as almost certainly from the collection of Grand Duchess Vladimir in 1958. The piece sells for £45,000 at auction 20 years later. More sophisticated testing reveals the platinum contains trace elements that weren't used in Russian metalwork until the 1930s. It's a fake, probably created in the 1940s. The original expert is dead by then, so whether he was fooled or complicit remains unknown. But the authentication gave the piece legitimacy that carried it through decades of ownership. And the people who bought based on his expert opinion are understandably upset. Auction houses face particularly difficult challenges because they profit from high-value sales, but also need to maintain reputations for authenticity. You're present at a Christie's meeting in 1962 where they're debating how to handle Romanov jewellery consignments. Conservative appraisers want to reject anything without ironclad provenance because the risk of embarrassing authentication failures is too high. Optimistic appraisers argue that overcaution means missing out on legitimate pieces and leaving money on the table. They compromise on enhanced due diligence, more extensive examination. Conservative catalogue descriptions that avoid definitive claims, and disclaimers about provenance uncertainty. It helps somewhat, but fakes still slip through with depressing regularity. The Cold War adds a bizarre political dimension to the authentication problem. The Soviet government periodically surfaces claiming ownership of pieces appearing in Western auctions, but their claims are inconsistent and seem motivated more by politics than genuine restitution efforts. Sometimes they demand return of pieces they claim are state property. Other times they ignore identical pieces at different auctions. The pattern suggests they are using authentication disputes as diplomatic leverage, Rather than systematically tracking down lost treasures, Western governments generally refused to enforce Soviet ownership claims, arguing that the original seizures were illegal, which just creates more legal uncertainty about who legitimately owns what. You discover a particularly strange case involving a diamond necklace that appears in 3 separate auctions between 1948 and 1965 each time, with different provenance stories. First, it's from a distinguished European collection, then it's formerly belonging to Russian nobility. Finally, it's authenticated as part of the imperial crown jewels. Either 3 different people independently owned the same necklace with different understandings of its history, or someone is deliberately creating and recreating provenance to increase value. Investigators eventually determine it's actually a clever fake one of those pieces using genuine old diamonds in a modern setting, but the fact that it fooled experts 3 times at major auction houses reveals how porous the authentication process really is. Some collectors respond to the authentication crisis by simply embracing uncertainty. They purchase possibly Romanov pieces at prices that reflect the ambiguity, paying more than they would for anonymous antique jewellery, but less than confirmed imperial pieces would command. It's a rational approach that acknowledges reality. These pieces might be authentic, might be fake, and you'll probably never know for sure, so price them accordingly. Other collectors become obsessed with authentication, spending years researching single pieces, hiring multiple experts, travelling to archives in search of documentation. Some succeed in confirming or debunking their pieces. Others just accumulate conflicting expert opinions and end up more confused than when they started. The authentication problem creates an interesting market dynamic. Pieces with strong provenance become exponentially more valuable, not just because they're authentic, but because authenticity itself is so rare. A diamond tiara that can be traced through photographs, sales receipts, and family records from imperial ownership through revolutionary chaos to present day is worth far more than an identical tiara without documentation, even if both are genuinely imperial. Certainty commands a premium in markets drowning in doubt. By the 1970s, new scientific testing methods start improving authentication reliability. Metallurgical analysis can date metals with reasonable precision. Advanced gemological techniques can identify characteristics of how diamonds were cut, which vary by era and region. Archival research becomes more systematic as Cold War tensions ease slightly and researchers gain access to previously sealed Soviet archives. The authentication success rate improves from basically guessing to reasonably confident, though absolute certainty remains elusive for most pieces. But here's the quirky reality that frustrates everyone involved. Some of the most obviously fake pieces become valuable in their own right as examples of skilled forgery and interesting artifacts of the post-revolutionary market in Russian imperial nostalgia. A well-made 1950s fake Romanov tiara, if properly identified as such, has value as a historical object documenting that era's obsession with lost imperial glamour. Is not worth millions like a real imperial piece. But it's worth more than its materials because it tells a different but still interesting story. The forgers probably didn't intend to create historically significant artifacts. But intent matters less than outcome when enough time passes. You leave the authentication world feeling slightly dizzy from the layers of deception, uncertainty, and competing claims. Every piece has multiple possible stories, and truth is less a fixed reality than a probability distribution across plausible narratives. Some pieces are certainly real, others are certainly fake, but vast quantities exist in the uncertain middle, where experts disagree. Documentation contradicts itself, and science can't quite provide definitive answers. In that uncertainty, The Romanov diamonds continue their strange afterlife objects simultaneously real and mythical, valuable and questionable, preserved and lost depending on which story you believe. You're descending into a secret KGB vault beneath Moscow in 1975 following two stone-faced guards who've made clear through gesture and glare that you're being granted extraordinary access to something most Soviet citizens don't even know exists. The elevator drops for what feels like several minutes. You're going deep, far below the city's metro system, into Cold War-era bunkers designed to survive nuclear attack. When the doors finally open, you step into a climate-controlled corridor lined with steel doors, each marked only with alphanumeric codes that mean nothing to you but presumably make sense to someone. The guard stops at door 7K, works through a combination lock that requires 3 separate codes entered in sequence, and swings open a vault door thick enough to stop a tank shell. Inside, arranged on industrial metal shelving that seems deliberately unglamorous given the contents, sit dozens of velvet-lined cases containing some of the most spectacular jewellery you've ever seen. These are the survivors' Romanov diamonds that made it through Revolution, Civil War, Stalin's liquidations, and World War II to remain in Soviet state custody. But here's the strange thing officially. Many of these pieces don't exist. The Soviet government publicly claims to have sold or distributed almost all imperial treasures during the 1920s and 30s for the people's benefit. Yet here they are, locked away in darkness, guarded by security so tight it borders on paranoid, hidden from both Soviet citizens and international observers. It's the worst kept state secret in a state built on secrets. The guard who still hasn't spoken a word gestures that you can look but not touch. You examine a tiara that matches descriptions of Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna's diamond kokoshnik, supposedly sold to an American collector in 1928, except here it is, in a KGB vault in 1975, clearly never having left Soviet custody. Either Soviet records lied about the sale, or this is an extremely sophisticated replica, or there were 2 identical tiaras and histories got confused. You're not brave enough to ask the guard which explanation is correct, assuming he even knows. The whole situation feels like discovering your government has a secret dragon in the basement extraordinary, inexplicable, and slightly terrifying. The existence of these hidden treasures reflects Cold War paranoia and Soviet institutional dysfunction in equal measure. Some pieces were deliberately retained as strategic reserve portable wealth that could be liquidated in emergency or used as political leverage if circumstances required. The Soviet leadership remembered how imperial treasures financed emergency needs during crises, and despite communist ideology denouncing such capitalist practices, they maintained their own version of the same system. Other pieces survived through bureaucratic confusion, marked for sale but never actually sold, then forgotten in some paperwork shuffle, rediscovered years later and quietly moved to secure storage, because admitting their continued existence would be embarrassing. Historians still argue about exactly what the KGB guarded collections contained during the Cold War because reliable information is scarce. Soviet archives from this period remain partially classified. Guards who worked these vaults rarely talked even after the USSR collapsed, and the few Western observers who got access provided only glimpses of what they saw. Estimates suggest anywhere from 50 to 200 significant pieces of imperial jewellery remained in secret state custody throughout the Soviet period. But that's a huge range reflecting genuine uncertainty rather than scholarly debate over interpretation. You notice something odd about how these pieces are stored. There's minimal documentation visible. Just numbered tags that presumably correspond to records kept elsewhere. No descriptions of historical significance, no provenance details, nothing identifying whose tiara this was or what coronation that crown witnessed. The Soviet system has stripped these objects of context, reducing them to pure material value, X carats of diamonds in platinum setting, worth Y amount on international markets if we ever need to sell, is the ultimate expression of Soviet ideology history and meaning a bourgeois sentimentality. Only material reality matters. The irony of communists hoarding crown jewels apparently escapes everyone involved, or at least nobody mentions it aloud. The security around these vaults is extraordinary even by Soviet standards. Guards rotate every 4 hours and never work consecutive shifts, preventing routine familiarity that might lead to complacency or corruption. Access requires authorization from multiple officials who rarely coordinate directly, meaning any single person trying to steal would need to compromise several separate security layers. The room itself is equipped with motion sensors, temperature monitors that detect body heat, and weight sensors on the shelving that trigger alarms if cases are removed without proper procedure. It's Fort Knox-level security for treasures that officially don't exist, which creates a philosophical puzzle if stealing these pieces wouldn't even be reported because doing so would require admitting they were here. Does the security protect the jewellery or the secret itself? You learn about a bizarre incident in 1968 when a KGB officer assigned to inventory vault contents noticed discrepancies between his physical count and official records. Several pieces listed in documents weren't present. Several pieces present weren't listed. He reported this through proper channels, triggering an investigation that consumed hundreds of hours of officials' time, ultimately concluding nothing. The investigation was classified. The officer was transferred to a position far from Moscow, and the discrepancies were never resolved. Whether this represented old theft, finally noticed, documentation errors, or something stranger remains unknown. The Soviet system was simultaneously obsessed with perfect record keeping and remarkably bad at maintaining accurate records, creating a paradox where you could be punished for discovering problems in a system that constantly generated problems. But here's the quirky detail that occasionally leaks out through defectors and later archival access. Some KGB officials used these vaults for side businesses. A colonel with vault access might temporarily borrow a diamond bracelet, have it photographed by a trusted jeweller who creates a detailed replica, return the original, and then sell the replica to Western collectors as an authentic Romanov piece smuggled out of Russia. The scheme worked because the replicas were genuinely old jewellery pre-revolutionary pieces purchased abroad, carefully selected to match Soviet-era documentation, genuinely Russian in style, and came with plausible smuggling stories. Buyers paid premium prices for authentic pieces that were technically fake but made from real components, while the originals remained safely in Soviet custody. It's fraud, but incredibly sophisticated fraud that required both access to state secrets and genuine expertise in jewellery history. The political symbolism of these hidden treasures shifts across Soviet decades. Under Stalin, their emergency reserves and proof that the state controls former imperial wealth. Under Khrushchev, during his de-Stalinization campaign, there's brief discussion of displaying them publicly as examples of Tsarist excess. But officials decide the optics are bad. Why did Soviet leadership keep them hidden if they're just educational exhibits? Under Brezhnev, the treasures simply sit in their vaults, neither acknowledged nor denied, existing in a strange limbo between secret asset and embarrassing reminder that Soviet practice differs from Soviet ideology. You watch during a rare authorized viewing when visiting Warsaw Pact officials are shown selected pieces as demonstration of Soviet custodianship of cultural heritage. The pieces are presented as proof that the USSR protects artistic treasures from capitalist exploitation, conveniently ignoring that similar Soviet treasures were sold to those same capitalists decades earlier. The visiting Poles and Czechs nod politely while surely noticing the contradiction. But international socialist solidarity apparently requires pretending not to notice when your allies' actions contradict their propaganda. Everyone maintains the fiction because maintaining fictions is how political alliances survive. Some Western intelligence agencies are aware these vaults exist. CIA reports from the 1970s reference undisclosed Soviet holdings of imperial jewelry, but the information is fragmentary and mixed with misinformation. The Soviets occasionally plant false stories about vault contents to confuse Western intelligence, claiming they hold pieces they don't, or denying pieces they do hold. The result is a fog of uncertainty where truth and deception blend until distinguishing between them requires more effort than the intelligence value justifies. The treasures become a footnote in Cold War spy games, less important than nuclear weapons or space programs, but still worth occasional attention from analysts who track everything. By the 1980s, as the Soviet system begins its terminal decline, these secret collections become increasingly anomalous. Glasnost creates pressure for transparency, and explaining why the state secretly hoards crown jewels becomes harder when citizens are questioning other state secrets. Officials start preparing for eventual public acknowledgement, creating proper documentation and inventory systems to replace the deliberately vague Cold War-era records. The transformation from state secret to state treasure begins, though it won't complete until after the USSR collapses. You leave the vault as the guard locks the massive door behind you, the mechanical clicks echoing in the underground corridor like a countdown to something inevitable. These diamonds survived revolution by hiding from revolutionaries, survived Stalin by pretending to be sold, survived the Cold War by existing in classified darkness. But you wonder if they can survive the approaching transition to whatever comes next. When transparency replaces secrecy and the Soviet Union's carefully maintained fictions finally collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, you're standing in a gleaming Moscow auction house in 1995, 4 years after the Soviet Union's collapse, watching newly minted Russian oligarchs bid against international collectors for a diamond necklace that just emerged from decades of obscurity. The starting bid is $500,000. Within 3 minutes, it reaches $2.3 million. The room crackles with energy that's part capitalist fever dream, part national pride competition, and part something darker men who made fortunes in the chaotic privatization of state assets, now competing to own fragments of the empire their grandparents' generation destroyed. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a diamond-edged saw. But nobody in the room seems interested in historical irony when there's bidding to do. The 1990s represent a strange renaissance for Romanov diamonds, as political upheaval creates opportunities for pieces to surface that have been hidden or lost for decades. The collapse of Soviet authority means formerly classified state collections become accessible, at least theoretically. State museums face catastrophic funding cuts and quietly consider selling pieces to keep institutions running. Private individuals who've hidden imperial jewelry through 70 years of communist rule suddenly can admit ownership without risking imprisonment. And most significantly, the explosion of organized crime and corruption creates channels for less legal forms of redistribution treasures walking out of inadequately guarded museums, vault contents mysteriously disappearing during inventories, and pieces from unknown sources appearing in markets where asking questions about provenance is considered impolite at best and dangerous at worst. The new Russian oligarchs approach imperial jewelry with complicated motivations. For some, its pure investment diamonds hold value better than rubles during hyperinflation and political instability. For others, its status competition, the man who owns the most spectacular Romanov pieces, proves his position at the top of Russia's new hierarchy. But there's also a genuine element of nationalism and historical recovery. These men see themselves as Russia's new elite. And what's more appropriate for Russia's elite than owning jewellery that once adorned Russia's imperial elite? They're not restoring the monarchy, but they're definitely appropriating its symbols. You watch Vladimir Potanin, mining magnate and one of Russia's richest men, acquire a diamond tiara at auction for $1.8 million, outbidding both Sotheby's representative and a Saudi prince. After the sale, Potanin tells reporters he plans to loan the piece to the Kremlin Armory Museum so the Russian people can enjoy what belongs to their heritage. It's a PR move, obviously, but it's also revealing the new oligarchs need to position themselves as patriotic custodians rather than greedy looters, even as they're literally buying up national treasures. The line between preserving heritage and hoarding wealth is thin and frequently crossed. Historians still argue about whether the 1990s surfacing of lost pieces represents recovery or further dispersal of the Romanov collection. Optimists point out that pieces hidden in obscurity are now documented, photographed, and sometimes placed in museums where researchers can study them. Pessimists note that many pieces flow into private collections with no public access, often leaving Russia entirely for international buyers, continuing the scattering that began in 1917. Both perspectives have merit, and the truth varies piece by piece. Some surfacing stories are genuinely heartwarming. An elderly woman in St. Petersburg reveals that her grandmother, a former palace maid, smuggled a diamond brooch out during revolutionary chaos, and the family has kept it hidden through 7 decades of Soviet rule. She sells it at auction, uses the proceeds to purchase a decent apartment, and expresses relief that the secret she carried her entire life can finally be released. The brooch ends up in a private collection in London, but at least its story is preserved, documented in auction records and media coverage that the Soviet era would never have permitted. Other surfacing stories are considerably darker. You follow reports of a diamond necklace that appears in a Geneva auction in 1997 with suspiciously vague provenance. Investigation reveals it was stolen from a Moscow museum during the chaotic early 90s, smuggled out of Russia through criminal networks, and laundered through several intermediaries before reaching the auction house. By the time authorities trace its path, the piece has been sold to a private collector who purchased in good faith and refuses to return it without compensation. The museum lacks funds to buy it back. The piece remains in foreign hands, its theft another casualty of post-Soviet institutional collapse. The Russian Orthodox Church becomes an unexpected player in recovering Romanov jewellery. Church officials argue that religious items' icon settings, cross pendants, ceremonial pieces used in Orthodox services were stolen from church property during Soviet atheist campaigns and should be returned regardless of current ownership. Some of these claims are legitimate. Others are opportunistic reaches where the church claims ownership of pieces that were always personal imperial property, not church assets. Courts across multiple countries issue contradictory rulings, creating legal chaos that makes authentication disputes look simple by comparison. You're present at a particularly surreal auction in 1998 where 3 different parties claim ownership of the same diamond tiara, a Russian museum insisting it was illegally removed from state collection, a woman claiming her grandmother fled Russia with it in 1919 and it's rightfully hers, and the current possessor who purchased it from a dealer and has receipts proving legal acquisition. The auction house, caught in the middle, freezes the sale pending legal resolution. 5 years later, the case remains unresolved. The tiara sits in a lawyer's vault, and all 3 parties have spent more in legal fees than the piece is worth. Nobody wins except the lawyers. which seems fitting for the 90s somehow. But here's the quirky detail that reveals the era's strange character. Some oligarchs commission exact replicas of imperial jewellery they can't acquire, using modern techniques to create pieces virtually indistinguishable from originals. They wear these replicas to social events, implying through careful non-denial that they have acquired Romanov treasures, enjoying the status boost without the expense. Other oligarchs do acquire real pieces, but commission matching replicas for security, wearing the fake to events while keeping the real piece in vaults, because kidnapping and theft are genuine concerns for the conspicuously wealthy in 1990s Russia. The result is a Hall of Mirrors situation where determining what's real versus replica requires expertise most observers lack, and the wearers have strong motivations to maintain ambiguity. The international market responds to these Russian reappearances with a mixture of excitement and caution. Prices for authenticated Romanov pieces surge as newly wealthy Russian buyers compete with established international collectors. But the flood of questionable pieces requiring authentication strains the expertise available. Auction houses develop new protocols, enhanced due diligence, conservative catalogue descriptions, and increasingly sophisticated scientific testing. Insurance companies start requiring additional verification before covering high-value Russian imperial pieces, having been burned too many times by subsequent authentication failures. You watch as Christie's auctions a spectacular diamond and emerald parure in 1996, catalogued with unusually detailed provenance, tracing it from Grand Duchess Vladimir's collection through her escape to Europe to her daughter's eventual sale to an English family in the 1920s. The documentation is solid, the pieces are magnificent, and the bidding is fierce. A Russian industrialist wins with a $4.2 million bid, declaring his intention to eventually return the pieces to Russia as repatriating national treasures. Whether he follows through is unclear 15 years later. The pieces have not appeared in any museum, but perhaps they're being preserved in his private collection. The line between private ownership and eventual repatriation is conveniently vague. By the early 2000s, as Putin consolidates power and Russia's economy stabilizes somewhat, the wild chaos of the 90s subsides. State museums improve security, laws regulating cultural property exports become stricter and occasionally even enforced. The flow of pieces surfacing from mysterious sources slows to a trickle. What emerged during that chaotic decade is now documented, sold and resettled into new collections. What remained hidden stays hidden, at least for now. The window of opportunity closes, and the Romanov diamonds settle into their new global distribution, some in museums, many in private collections, all carrying stories of their 90s re-emergence that are simultaneously hopeful and troubling depending on your perspective on what should happen to national treasures when nations collapse. You're sitting in a Geneva courtroom in 2008 watching lawyers argue over a diamond bracelet with an intensity usually reserved for murder trials. The bracelet sits in a sealed evidence bag on the judge's bench, catching fluorescent light with indifferent brilliance while three parties claim ownership with varying degrees of legal sophistication. On one side, the Russian Federation's Cultural Ministry, arguing the piece is state property illegally removed during revolutionary chaos and demanding repatriation under international heritage protection laws. On another side, descendants of Grand Duchess Xenia Alexandrovna, claiming the bracelet was personal property their grandmother legitimately removed when fleeing Russia and therefore belongs to her heirs. And on the third side, a Swiss collector who purchased the bracelet at auction in good faith 20 years ago and possesses clear title under Swiss law. The judge looks exhausted. And you understand why she's essentially being asked to adjudicate a century of history, revolution, and competing legal frameworks using tools designed for much simpler property disputes. This case is just one of dozens that proliferate in international courts during the 2000s and 2010 eras, as the long-delayed legal reckoning over Romanov jewelry finally arrives. The collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia's reintegration into international legal frameworks creates opportunities for claims that were impossible during the Cold War. Romanov descendants who've spent decades nursing grievances suddenly have venues to pursue them. Museums and private collectors who thought their ownership was settled discover that international law is considerably more ambiguous than they hoped. And lawyers discover that litigating these cases is lucratively complicated, because you're not just arguing about object, you're arguing about whether the Bolshevik Revolution was a legitimate government transition or an illegal usurpation, whether Soviet-era sales were valid transactions or trafficking in stolen goods, and whether current possessors are innocent purchasers or knowing receivers of property acquired through violence. The Russian government's position is straightforward in theory. All Romanov property became state property in 1917 through revolutionary decree. Therefore, anything that left Russia after that date was stolen from the state and should be returned. They have some legal precedent for this. International courts have sometimes recognized revolutionary property transfers as legitimate, particularly when the new government achieves widespread recognition and stability. But they also have significant problems. The Soviet government itself sold many pieces, deliberately liquidating state property for cash. So claiming those pieces are stolen is arguing that the USSR stole from itself. And Russia's current legal standing to represent Soviet-era claims is questionable, given that the USSR technically dissolved and Russia is a successor state, not the same legal entity. Romanov descendants make different arguments depending on which pieces they're claiming. For items that were clearly personal property, engagement rings, gifts, jewelry commissioned privately, they argue the revolutionary seizure was theft, pure and simple, and current possessors are holding stolen property regardless of good faith purchases. International law is somewhat sympathetic to this argument, particularly regarding property seized from individuals fleeing persecution. But for items that were part of the official crown jewels or state collections, descendants' claims are weaker. Those pieces weren't personal property even under the imperial system. They belonged to the institution of the crown, which ceased to exist in 1917. Arguing for their return requires claiming the revolution was illegitimate, which most international courts are reluctant to adjudicate. Historians still argue about whether these legal battles serve justice or simply enrich lawyers while providing no real resolution. Some cases reach settlements. Museums agree to display pieces with acknowledgement of contested ownership, or private collectors return items to descendants in exchange for tax benefits and positive publicity. But many cases drag on for years, consuming resources on all sides, ultimately settling nothing beyond establishing that the legal situation is hopelessly complex and everyone has some claim to rightness. You follow the case of the Sittingbourne tiara, a diamond piece that appeared at a country estate sale in England in 2005. Initial research suggested it might be from Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna's collection. Based on design similarities to known pieces, Romanov descendants filed a claim, arguing it was stolen property their great-grandmother fled Russia to escape. The current owner countered that his grandfather purchased it legitimately in 1927 from a dealer who provided proper documentation. Russia's cultural ministry then intervened, claiming that even if the purchase was legitimate, the original dealer had no right to sell state property. The case eventually settled when metallurgical testing revealed the tiara was actually made in the 1930s, a very good replica of an imperial design, but not an original piece. 3 years of litigation, hundreds of thousands in legal fees. And the answer was, this is an expensive fake. Everyone lost except the lawyers. Some museums face particularly difficult situations because they acquired pieces decades ago in good faith, but now face restitution claims backed by improved documentation and changed political circumstances. The Metropolitan Museum in New York spent 5 years fighting a claim over a diamond necklace in their collection, ultimately settling by acknowledging the piece's Romanov provenance in exhibition materials and establishing a rotating loan agreement where Romanov descendants get temporary custody every 5 years. Is this justice compromise? Both parties acting reasonably given impossible circumstances? Depends who you ask. But here's the aspect that makes these legal battles particularly frustrating. Many can't be resolved because facts are genuinely unknowable. When a piece disappeared from imperial custody in 1917 and surfaced in Paris in 1924, did it get stolen during revolutionary chaos, sold by Soviet officials, or smuggled out by a fleeing aristocrat? Often, there's no documentation that would definitively answer this question. Witnesses are long dead, records were destroyed or never existed. You're left with competing narratives that fit the available evidence equally well, and choosing between them requires making assumptions about what probably happened rather than what documentably happened. The European Court of Human Rights issues an interesting ruling in 2011 regarding a case involving a diamond brooch, claimed by both Russian state museums and a Romanov descendant. The court essentially says that when property ownership is genuinely ambiguous due to revolutionary chaos and subsequent decades of legal limbo, current possessors who acquired in good faith have stronger claims than distant claimants, regardless of historical injustice. The ruling infuriates those seeking restitution but reflects practical reality. International law can't undo a century of transactions and transfers without creating more chaos than it resolves. Justice delayed really is justice denied. Not because courts lack sympathy, but because too much time and too many intervening events make meaningful restitution impossible. You're present at a 2015 symposium where legal scholars, art historians, and stakeholders gather to discuss frameworks for resolving these disputes. The proposals range from practical to fantastical international tribunals specifically for Revolutionary-era property claims, mediated settlements encouraged through tax incentives, blanket amnesty for current possessors in exchange for documentation and research access, or simply accepting that legal resolution is impossible and focusing instead on documenting and sharing knowledge about dispersed pieces. Nobody agrees on solutions, but at least they're talking, which is better than the decades of silence when Cold War politics prevented these conversations entirely. Some oligarchs and private collectors start proactively addressing ownership questions by establishing provenance research funds and agreeing to independent scholarship examining their collections. Done. This is partly public relations demonstrating they're responsible custodians rather than greedy hoarders, but also reflects genuine uncertainty. When you purchase a supposedly imperial piece, you want to know if legal challenges might emerge, and funding serious research is cheaper than fighting lawsuits. The research sometimes reveals uncomfortable truths. Yes, your tiara is authentic, and yes, it was probably stolen from a woman who was murdered, and no, there's no clear legal path for her descendants to reclaim it because too many intervening transactions separate original theft from current ownership. By the late 2010s, the initial wave of legal battles settles into stalemate. Most achievable settlements have been reached. Most hopeless cases have been abandoned. What remains are disputes too complex or too politically charged for resolution, likely to continue until all parties exhaust resources or interest. The Romanov diamonds remain scattered across museums, private collections, and contested spaces where ownership is perpetually under discussion. The legal battles achieve some good, better documentation, public acknowledgement of complicated histories, occasional restitution or compromise, but mostly they reveal that law is a crude tool for addressing historical injustice, particularly when that injustice unfolded across revolutions, world wars, and radical political transformations that make establishing clear title nearly impossible. You leave the Geneva courtroom as lawyers pack their briefcases, the diamond bracelet returning to sealed evidence storage, pending appeals that will probably continue for years. Justice feels less like a destination and more like an ongoing negotiation between competing claims, each with some validity, none with enough to completely triumph. Maybe that's the best available outcome when history is this messy and property has passed through this many hands. Or maybe it's just what happens when we try to use present legal frameworks to resolve past catastrophes that those frameworks were never designed to address. You're standing in a private research library in London in 2019, surrounded by archival boxes containing faded photographs, auction catalogues, and handwritten letters in Russian, French, and English. A dedicated researcher named Eleanor has spent 15 years of her life tracking a single diamond necklace, the Moonlight Necklace, supposedly commissioned by Alexander III for his wife Maria Feodorovna, featuring 118 diamonds arranged in a cascading pattern meant to evoke moonlight on water. The piece appears in exactly 3 pre-revolutionary photographs, always worn by Maria, always spectacular. After 1917 it vanishes completely. No sale records, no theft reports, no sightings in any collection, auction or museum for over a century. Eleanor has traced every possible lead, interviewed descendants, examined thousands of pieces looking for matches, and consulted with experts across 3 continents. Her conclusion: reached with obvious heartbreak, the Moonlight Necklace almost certainly no longer exists in any recognisable form. It was probably broken apart for the stone shortly after the Revolution. The distinctive setting melted down, and the individual diamonds sold or incorporated into other pieces. The necklace is lost not because it's hidden, but because it was destroyed. This is the haunting reality of the never-found Romanov pieces. Many aren't lost in the sense of misplaced or hidden. They're gone, deliberately dismantled and transformed beyond recognition. Because diamonds have value, but distinctive imperial settings create complications. You're looking at the phantom collection pieces documented in pre-revolutionary records, photographed at court events, inventoried in palace catalogues, but which haven't appeared anywhere in over a century despite intensive searching by motivated researchers and collectors. The list is heartbreakingly long: specific tiaras worn by specific Grand Duchesses, necklaces commissioned for specific occasions, entire parures that existed as unified sets, but now exist only as historical footnotes. The most legendary never-found piece is Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna's engagement ring, given to her by Prince William of Sweden when they were briefly engaged in 1908 before family politics derailed the match. The ring featured a 15-carat diamond in a platinum setting, surrounded by smaller diamonds arranged in a pattern Maria herself designed. Contemporary accounts describe it as extraordinarily beautiful and deeply meaningful to Maria, who wore it constantly even after the engagement ended. After the imperial family's imprisonment and murder, the ring disappears. Legends proliferate. It's hidden in the Ipatiev house basement where the family died. It was smuggled out by a sympathetic guard. Maria was wearing it when she was killed, and it was stolen from her body. It's buried in an unmarked location that only one person knew, and they took the secret to their grave. Despite decades of searching, including archaeological excavations at relevant sites, nobody has found it. Historians still argue about what percentage of the original imperial collection is truly lost versus simply unrecognized in current collections. Conservative estimates suggest 20 to 30% of documented pieces have vanished beyond recovery. More pessimistic scholars claim 50% or higher, arguing that many supposedly survived pieces are actually replacements or similar pieces mistaken for originals due to incomplete documentation. The uncertainty reflects fundamental problems. Pre-revolutionary inventories were incomplete. Revolutionary-era documentation was chaotic, and distinguishing between lost and unrecognized requires certainty about identification that's often impossible with jewelry. You follow the case of the 400-carat brooch, mentioned in several letters from Alexandra to her sister, but never photographed or formally inventoried. Alexandra describes it as impossibly large, rather vulgar honestly, but impressive when political impression is needed. The description suggests it existed, but without photographs or inventory records, searching for it is nearly impossible. What does a 400-carat brooch look like? What design, what era? Researchers have identified several large brooches in various collections that might match, but without definitive proof, they remain possibly the 400-carat brooch rather than confirmed identifications. And there's always the possibility Alexandra was exaggerating. Maybe it was 200 carats. Or maybe 400 carats was family hyperbole for very large, making identification even harder. Some never-found pieces inspire obsessive searches bordering on treasure hunting. A British researcher spent 20 years convinced that Grand Duchess Anastasia's personal jewellery collection was hidden in a specific location based on cryptic references in letters and his interpretation of architectural plans of houses the family occupied. He conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys, obtained permissions for limited excavations, and even purchased a property to dig more thoroughly. He found nothing, eventually concluding that if anything was ever hidden there, it was recovered long ago by someone who left no records. His story is simultaneously dedicated and cautionary. The difference between determined research and obsessive delusion is sometimes just whether you find anything. But here's the quirky detail that gives researchers nightmares. Some pieces may be hiding in plain sight, misidentified in museums or collections as something other than Romanov jewellery. A diamond tiara catalogued as French Imperial, circa 1,900 inches, might actually be Russian Imperial, mislabeled due to stylistic similarities and incomplete provenance. Loose diamonds in a dealer's inventory might include stones from broken-up Romanov pieces, but without distinctive characteristics. They're just high-quality old-cut diamonds with uncertain history. The more time passes and the more pieces get reworked or decontextualized, the harder identification becomes. You might be looking directly at a lost Romanov diamond and have no way to know it. The human stories behind the never-found pieces are particularly poignant. An elderly woman in Paris spent her final years insisting her mother had given her a diamond bracelet that belonged to Grand Duchess Tatiana. But the bracelet was sold during World War II to buy food, and the woman couldn't remember who purchased it, or any identifying details. She just knew it was gone, and with it, her last tangible connection to a history her family survived. Researchers tried helping her locate it through records of wartime jewellery sales, but thousands of bracelets were sold during that period, and without better description or documentation, finding that specific one proved impossible. She died not knowing what happened to it, which somehow feels representative of the entire lost collection mourned by people who remember, invisible to people who might unknowingly possess it. Some never-found pieces weren't even jewellery in the traditional sense. The imperial collection included decorative objects set with diamond cigarette cases, picture frames, writing implements, religious icons, even furniture inlays. These items are even more vulnerable to destruction or transformation because they're less obviously valuable than wearable jewellery. A diamond set icon might be valued for its religious significance and the diamonds ignored or removed. A cigarette case might be melted down for the gold and silver while the diamond decoration is discarded as merely decorative rather than valuable. The utilitarian context makes preservation less likely. You examine records of the most systematic search ever conducted, a Soviet-era project in the 1960s, when officials decided to catalogue exactly what remained in state custody versus what was genuinely lost. The project took 5 years, involved dozens of researchers, and produced volumes of documentation that remain partially classified. The conclusions were sobering of approximately 15,000 significant items in the pre-revolutionary imperial jewellery collection. Soviet researchers could definitively account for only about 6,000. That means 9,000 pieces, more than half, were either sold, stolen, destroyed, or so thoroughly lost that even the KGB couldn't find them. The numbers shocked officials, who had apparently believed more survived. The study was quietly shelved rather than published, because admitting such massive losses was politically uncomfortable. Modern technology offers new hope for finding lost pieces. Databases now track auction results globally, using image recognition to compare pieces against pre-revolutionary photographs. Metal composition analysis can sometimes match specific pieces to known Russian imperial metalworking practices. Social media and crowdsourcing allow researchers to cast wider nets, sometimes leading to identification of pieces in unexpected places. A 2017 breakthrough came when someone posted a photograph of their grandmother's jewellery to a genealogy website, and sharp-eyed researchers recognised earrings matching a pair documented in Grand Duchess Olga's collection. The family had no idea of their significance, having inherited them with vague stories of Russian origins but no specifics. DNA testing of microscopic organic residue might eventually allow matching jewellery to specific wearers, though this remains more theoretical than practical. But even optimistic researchers acknowledge that many pieces are simply gone beyond recovery. Diamonds broken out of settings and sold as loose stones. Platinum melted and reused. Distinctive designs dismantled to avoid recognition. The economics that drove those destructions were rational. A unique imperial piece attracts attention and questions, while loose diamonds and scrap metal are fungible commodities that leave no trail. Every owner who chose discretion and profit over historical preservation made individual sense. While collectively destroying irreplaceable artifacts, it's a tragedy of the commons played out across luxury goods. You close the research folders feeling the weight of absence. All these pieces that existed mattered to people, documented empire and family, and then vanished like they never were. The never-found Romanov diamonds exist now primarily as ghosts described in letters, visible in photographs, catalogued in inventories, but physically gone from the world. Eleanor, the researcher who spent 15 years chasing the moonlight necklace, summarises it perfectly. Sometimes the most important historical work is documenting what's lost, so at least we remember there was something to lose. You're standing in the Moscow Kremlin's Diamond Fund exhibition hall on a quiet Tuesday morning in 2024, separated from Catherine the Great's diamond collection by just a few inches of bulletproof glass. The pieces glow under carefully calibrated museum lighting designed to display every facet without causing degradation. LED systems that mimic natural daylight but contain none of the damaging UV wavelengths that would, over decades, affect the materials around you. Tourists from a dozen countries lean close, taking photographs despite the no-flash signs, whispering in multiple languages about the impossible beauty contained in these cases. These are the survivors, the pieces that made it through revolution. Civil War, Stalin's liquidations, Nazi invasion, Cold War secrecy, and post-Soviet chaos to arrive here, in this present moment, still magnificent, still telling stories for anyone willing to listen. The Orloff diamond catches your attention first, that massive 18962 carat stone that allegedly started its journey in an Indian temple. Possibly stolen by a French deserter, definitely purchased by Count Orloff to win Catherine's favour. It sits in the imperial sceptre, exactly where it's been since 1774, a testament to institutional continuity that survived everything else falling apart. The stone has witnessed empires rise and collapse, ideologies replace each other, political systems overthrow themselves, yet here it remains, implacably itself. Diamonds are perhaps the ultimate survivors, harder than anything else natural, immune to time's erosion, indifferent to human drama. This stone will likely still exist long after Moscow has crumbled to dust, still catching light with the same cold perfection it displays today. You move to the Shah diamond, examining the Persian inscriptions etched into its surface, names of rulers who owned it across centuries, a genealogy written in stone. This 88. 7-carat yellow diamond has a particularly dark history. It came to Russia as compensation for the 1829 murder of Russian diplomat Alexander Griboyedov in Tehran, essentially blood money transformed into a diplomatic gift. The diamond doesn't reflect that violence in its appearance. Of course, it's just beautiful. The inscription's just decorative calligraphy. Unless you read Persian and know the history, objects carry meaning we assign them, not meaning inherent to their physical form. The imperial crown draws crowds, everyone wants to see the crown, even though Russia hasn't had an emperor in over a century. Created for Catherine the Great's coronation in 1762, it contains 4 936 diamonds, arranged in patterns representing oak leaves and acorns, symbols of power and longevity that prove somewhat ironic given the dynasty's eventual fate. The crown weighs nearly 5 pounds, which explains why coronation portraits show emperors looking slightly uncomfortable despite their triumph. Try balancing 5 pounds of metal and stones on your head for 5 hours while maintaining imperial dignity. It's a physical endurance test disguised as pageantry. But you're most drawn to the smaller, more personal pieces scattered throughout the collection. A diamond brooch that belonged to Maria Feodorovna, not the grandest piece, not the most valuable, just a delicate floral design she wore frequently in photographs. It survived because it ended up in the Kremlin vault rather than her personal luggage. A random artifact of which pieces were where when revolution struck. Seeing it here, you imagine Maria fastening it to her dress on some ordinary morning in 1915, not knowing that within 2 years her world would end and this brooch would become a museum piece. Appreciated by strangers rather than worn by family, historians still argue about what these surviving pieces represent: triumph of preservation or reminder of loss. Are we celebrating that these treasures survived, or mourning everything that didn't both? Probably. The glass cases create strange emotional dynamics. These objects are accessible to millions now, democratically available for anyone with a museum ticket, no longer hidden in private palaces. That's arguably more just than private ownership by hereditary monarchs. Yet something is lost when jewellery designed for wearing becomes jewellery for viewing, when pieces meant to adorn living bodies become specimens under glass, studied but not experienced in their intended context. You notice something that wouldn't have been obvious to visitors decades ago. Every label now includes multiple narratives. The official Russian state interpretation, imperial treasures preserved for the people. The historical context, created during period of autocratic rule. The artistic appreciation, masterwork of 18th century jewellery craft. The labels don't resolve contradictions between these perspectives, they let them coexist, acknowledging that objects this complex support multiple interpretations simultaneously. It's more honest than propaganda, but less satisfying than certainty. A school group passes through, teenagers with their teacher who's trying to convey why these old rocks matter. You listen as she explains that these pieces connect present Russia to its imperial past, that understanding history requires engaging with beautiful and terrible things, that diamonds are both valuable and ethically complicated. Some students seem engaged, taking notes, asking questions about specific pieces. Others look bored, clearly wondering why they're spending a Tuesday morning looking at jewellery when they could be literally anywhere else. Both reactions seem reasonable, and not everyone has to care about historical artefacts, even spectacular ones. But here's what strikes you as you complete the circuit through the exhibition: these pieces have outlived everyone who originally cared about them. Catherine, who commissioned with such passion, Maria, who wore with such pride, Alexandra, whose favourite tiara may or may not be here under a different label, the Grand Duchesses who posed in matching parures, the craftsmen who spent years creating perfection, the revolutionaries who seized these symbols of oppression, the Soviet officials who decided what to sell and what to save, all gone while the diamonds remain, passing from hand to hand, vault to vault, meaning to meaning, but fundamentally unchanged in their molecular structure. You wonder about the pieces that aren't here, the scattered sisters of these survivors, spread across museums, private collections, and lost to history. Do you remember the pink diamond suite that vanished without trace? The moonlight necklace that was probably destroyed Alexandra's cursed tiara that disappeared into chaos? The complete parures that were broken apart, the pieces sitting in oligarch vaults, or American heiress collections, or misidentified in provincial museums? This exhibition shows what survived, but the absences are equally important, equally part of the story. Every piece here represents 10 that didn't make it. The museum closes for the day, and you watch as guards begin their shutdown procedures covering cases, checking security systems, preparing the diamonds for another night of illuminated solitude in their bulletproof houses. The pieces will rest here until tomorrow brings new visitors, new cameras, new questions about value and beauty and historical justice. The diamonds don't care. They'll catch light and throw sparkles with the same physics they've always followed, indifferent to human concerns about ownership, meaning, and preservation. Walking out into Moscow evening, you carry the weight of everything you've seen: beauty that survived catastrophe, wealth that outlasted the system that created it, objects that became symbols, became commodities, became museum pieces in a cycle that strips away original meaning while adding new layers. The Romanov diamonds exist in multiple states simultaneously as physical objects, carbon compressed into crystal lattice. As historical artifacts, evidence of past wealth and power, as aesthetic experiences, beautiful things that inspire wonder, and as ethical questions: how should we engage with beauty born from exploitation? Do you remember, at the beginning of this journey, standing in Catherine's palace while she examined that first major acquisition, that diamond necklace that started the obsession? You've travelled through centuries now, watching the collection grow, scatter, hide, re-emerge, and partially reconsolidate. The story doesn't have a clean ending because the diamonds keep existing, keep circulating, keep accumulating new meanings while never quite releasing old ones. They're simultaneously lost and found, preserved and scattered, imperial and democratic, valuable and troubling. Some pieces will surface tomorrow, next year, next decade, discovered in attics, recognised in photographs, identified through new research techniques we haven't invented yet. Others are gone forever, existing only in documentation and memory. The question isn't whether we'll ever reassemble the complete collection. We won't. That's impossible. The question is what we do with the pieces we have, display them honestly, acknowledging their complicated histories. Return them to descendants who have moral claims, keep them as state treasures, sell them, and use proceeds for present needs. There's no obviously correct answer, which is why the debates continue. The legal cases proliferate, and the diamonds themselves remain silent on questions of their proper fate. The diamonds wait in their cases, patient as only geology can be patient. You close your eyes, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of history settle into something softer. The glass cases fade from your mind. The museum dims. You're left only with the gentle knowledge that some beautiful things survive, even when everything else changes. Some stories persist, even when the people who lived them are long gone, and some mysteries remain mysteries, which is perhaps exactly as it should be. The Romanov diamonds will still be there tomorrow, catching light, telling stories, waiting for the next person to wonder where all the missing sisters went. But you don't need to wonder anymore tonight. You've walked through the palaces and vaults, the auction houses and courtrooms, the careful preservation and careless destruction. You've seen what survived and mourned what didn't. And now, finally, you can rest. The diamonds continue without you, as they always have, beautiful, troubling, magnificent, complicated but ultimately just objects, reflecting whatever meaning we bring to them. And in the soft darkness behind your closing eyes, that seems like enough understanding for one night. Sleep well. The treasures both found and lost will keep their watch while you dream.